Hey guys, tonight we drift into the golden glow of torches licking at damp stone walls, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and warmed wine, the kind that clings to your cloak and makes the shadows seem thicker. You're standing, well, slouching a bit, in a palace corridor where velvet cushions are just a little too plush, where the hush of the night is broken only by a faint giggle from somewhere you can't quite place. You probably won't survive this in one piece if you take it all too seriously. These are royal secrets, after all, the kind that could get you tossed into a chilly dungeon for knowing too much. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments, because it's always fun to know where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the first of these chambers, where the thrones aren't just seats of power, they're monuments to temptation, cunning, and whispered scandal. The cushions are stitched with gold thread, and the tapestries show heroic hunts and noble banquets, but you can't help noticing that the corners of the woven images seem suggestive. A stag hunt that's a little too intimate, a courtly dance that somehow has everyone looking at the wrong partner. It's the kind of subtle hint that makes you smirk and glance over your shoulder to see if anyone else noticed. Velvet thrones, you find, aren't just about comfort, they're about theatre. They tell a story of control and ease, of a monarch who can sit for hours without fidgeting because all the real action is happening in sly glances and coded words. You catch the faint scrape of a slippered foot somewhere nearby, maybe in an alcove, where two courtiers lean a bit too close to each other. You hear their voices drop low, like they know you're listening. The thing about medieval courts, especially the ones with reputations for interesting rulers, is that the power is never in the grand speeches, it's in the quiet moments between them. That's where you'd hear about the feast planned not for political unity, but for introducing the king's newest favourite. Historians still argue whether these favourites were truly romantic interests or simply pawns in the endless chess game of noble alliances, but the gossip never seemed to care about such nuance. You move past the great hall's open doors. Inside, musicians are plucking lutes in a rhythm just slow enough to encourage lazy swaying. The king isn't here, he's somewhere more private, but his influence is everywhere. The silver goblets are rimmed in gold, the meat is roasted until it falls off the bone, and the laughter that rolls through the space is tinged with something just a touch conspiratorial. You feel it in the air, like static before a storm. In a smaller side chamber you find something even more telling. The royal wardrobe. Not just rows of furs and embroidered doublets, but an entire wall of jewelled belts and rings that are far too extravagant to be worn in daylight. These are the accessories for candlelit hours, for audiences of one or two, not a court of hundreds. It's the medieval version of that outfit you only wear when you know exactly who's coming over. And you can't help but chuckle at the thought that kings were just as guilty of this as anyone scrolling through an online shop at 2 a.m. One piece in particular catches your eye, a golden circlet with tiny carved figures along its band. At first glance they're saints or angels, but as you look closer their poses seem a little unconventional. You glance back at the door to make sure no one sees you smirking. Did the king wear this to council meetings, or was it reserved for after-banquet entertainments? Historians still debate the symbolism of such trinkets, whether they were coded messages of loyalty, inside jokes among the elite, or just decorative choices gone rogue. You leave the wardrobe behind and slip into a gallery lined with portraits. The kings here stare down at you with expressions that are meant to inspire respect, but somehow manage to look just a bit smug, as if they know you've been poking around their private things. One particularly striking portrait shows a king leaning on a scepter carved with vines and fruit, an innocent motif on paper, but given what you've heard in hushed tones tonight, you can't help thinking the symbolism was intentional. There's a rhythm to this palace that you start to pick up, a public pulse of ceremony and a private heartbeat of indulgence. You feel it in the way servants move, quick and efficient in the day, but slow and whispering now, as if they're part of the king's carefully curated night. And maybe they are. You pass a doorway where a chessboard sits mid-game. The pieces are carved ivory, but one knight is tipped over beside the queen, almost as if in surrender. You can't tell if the game was abandoned for lack of interest, or if the players simply found a more engaging pastime. This is how history leaves its clues, not in grand declarations, but in the tilted knight no one bothers to put away. And of course, you start to think about how these velvet thrones and silken corridors might have shaped decisions far beyond the bedroom. Treaties signed not because they were wise, but because someone's brother was married to someone's sister who happened to be the king's newest infatuation. War declared not because of a border dispute, but because an insult was overheard in the wrong chamber at the wrong hour. Some would say this paints medieval monarchs in too cynical a light, that their personal indulgences were kept separate from governance. Others would argue that the two were inseparable, that in a world where every relationship was a political tool, romance and power games were just two sides of the same gold coin. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. You end up back in the great hall, now quiet, the musicians gone. A single candle flickers at the high table, casting a long shadow of the throne against the wall. It looks taller this way, more imposing, but also lonelier. You imagine the king sitting there after everyone's gone, crowned slightly askew, wondering if any of it, wealth, power, scandal, was worth the endless whispers. And you, drifting through this space, realize that tonight's story isn't just about perversion in the salacious sense. It's about the ways power warps human desires, and how even velvet thrones can't cushion a restless mind. The gold thread phrase, the cushions flatten, but the whispers, those survive centuries. You wander further down the shadowy corridors until the air begins to change, thicker somehow, tinged with the faint tang of spilled wine and the warm musk of too many bodies pressed together in too small a space. You found your way into the realm of King John of England, and his court feels immediately different from the plush velvet stage you left behind. Here, the energy is restless, like a dinner party where everyone knows they're about to be part of the gossip tomorrow. The wooden beams above are blackened from decades of candle smoke, and the rushes underfoot are strewn with rosemary and lavender, a fragrant attempt to cover less appealing smells. You step around a discarded chicken bone and feel the slight stick of honeyed ale beneath your shoes. It's the sort of mess that would horrify a modern interior designer, but felt almost comforting here. Proof that life at court wasn't all formality. It was indulgence, sometimes to the point of chaos. You spot John himself at the far end of the room. He's not the towering figure you might expect from the man who signed the Magna Carta, under protest of course, but he has a presence. His eyes are sharp, scanning the room as though each guest is both a potential ally and a possible threat. You notice the way his hand lingers on the shoulder of a passing lady-in-waiting, his smile charming but calculated. Historians still argue whether John's notorious appetite for romantic entanglements was genuine passion or simply a political weapon he couldn't resist using. A few courtiers stand near the wall, their voices low. You catch snippets, something about a merchant's wife, a clandestine meeting in the garden after Mass. The names change, but the pattern is clear. King John is not shy about pursuing women who already have husbands. In a world where marriage is a contract between families, this is the sort of thing that sparks more than just moral outrage. It sparks feuds, alliances, and the occasional dagger hidden in a robe. You move toward the high table, where platters of venison glisten under the torchlight. The king isn't eating much, his attention is elsewhere. Every so often he calls someone closer, a noblewoman, a knight, even a servant. and whispers something in their ear. Sometimes they laugh, sometimes they nod gravely. You get the sense that John thrives on knowing more than anyone else in the room. The gossip flows to him like wine, and he drinks it just as eagerly. There's a moment when the music shifts from lively to languid, the kind of change that draws the night into a softer, more dangerous mood. You feel it ripple through the crowd. The couples who had been politely dancing begin to drift toward the corners. Conversations turn from trade agreements to whispered confessions. And somewhere in the middle of it all, John slips away. Not hurriedly. No, he's too practiced for that. He simply eases into a side door as if he's checking on the kitchens. You know better. Curiosity tugs at you, so you follow. The corridor beyond is quieter, the air cooler. You hear faint laughter from behind a half-closed door. Peeking in, you see John seated beside a young noblewoman, his voice low but animated. On the table beside them, a parchment lies half unrolled. You can't read the words from here, but you wonder, are they drafting a letter to an ally, or is it something far less formal? Historians still debate the nature of some of John's private correspondence, especially the ones that never reached their intended destinations. You step back before you're noticed and make your way toward the outer courtyard. The moonlight bathes the stone in silver, and you catch sight of a pair of guards exchanging a knowing glance. They've seen this before, they probably see it every night. You almost ask them for details, but something in their posture suggests that speaking too freely about the king's activities might be hazardous to your health. Back inside, the atmosphere has shifted again. Without John at the high table, the court feels lighter, less tense. A group of minstrels begins playing a bawdy tune, one that earns a few scandalized looks from the older nobles and laughter from the younger crowd. A jester juggles apples, deliberately dropping one to snatch a kiss from a giggling maid before tossing it back into the air. You realize that in John's absence, the court entertains itself in ways that feel just as reckless as the king's own pursuits. There's a small alcove off the main hall where you notice a curious object, a silver hand mirror with a handle shaped like a swan's neck. The surface is polished to perfection, reflecting your face in the dim light. But etched around the edge is a series of tiny crowns, each with a different gemstone in the center. You've heard whispers that John gifts mirrors like this to his favorites, tokens that double as subtle declarations of favor. Some historians think it's just a courtly tradition. Others suspect it's a private game of marking territory. The night wears on, and you find yourself drifting towards the kitchens, drawn by the rich scent of spiced wine. Here, the servants move with brisk efficiency, but their chatter is lively. You overhear a cook telling a stable hand that the king once ordered an entire roast swan to be delivered to a lady's chamber at midnight, simply because she'd mentioned missing the taste from her childhood. The stable hand laughs, but you notice the way his eyes dart toward the door. Stories like that aren't for every ear. You linger a while longer, sipping from a cup someone presses into your hand, feeling the warmth spread through you. It's easy to get caught up in the rhythm of this court, where power and pleasure twist together until they're impossible to separate. You can see how someone like John could make allies in the same breath as he made lovers, how his charm might smooth over diplomatic blunders or spark entirely new ones. As you finally step back into the cooler night air, you think about how this version of history doesn't always make it into the neat summaries. The Magna Carta gets the headlines, but the private moments, the honeyed wine, the secret corridors, the silver mirrors, are what shape the mood of a reign. And maybe that's why John's story still feels alive tonight, humming under the torchlight, waiting for the next whisper to join its chorus. The corridor feels narrower now, the stone closer, as though the palace itself is leaning in to hear your footsteps. You follow the scent of warm beeswax and something richer, perfume, faint but unmistakable. and find yourself stepping into the private world of Ethelbald of Wessex. Here, the air is different again, softer somehow, but charged, as if every candle's flame has its own secret to keep. The first thing you notice is how the light glances off the polished oak furniture, turning every carved edge into a line of molten gold. This is not the utilitarian wood of common halls. This is craftsmanship designed to impress, to remind you that the man who sits here can command the time and skill of the best artisans in the land. And yet, the most famous thing about Ethelbald isn't the throne he inherited. It's the union that shocked his kingdom, his marriage to Judith, the widow of his own father. You ease closer to a tapestry on the far wall. It's an intricate scene, a coronation, the new king crowned by the bishop, the court gathered around. But in the corner, almost as an afterthought, two figures stand closer than protocol would suggest. One is unmistakably Ethelbald, the other, a woman in a coronet, her hand just brushing his. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate foreshadowing by the weaver or a later embellishment by someone with a taste for scandal. The marriage itself was, by all accounts, a bold defiance of both church and custom. You imagine the whispers that must have rolled through Wessex like a summer storm, the old king barely in his grave, and his son wedding the young, beautiful queen. Some would have called it a consolidation of power, ensuring that Judith's Frankish connections stayed firmly tied to Wessex. Others would have seen it as something far less strategic, an indulgence pure and simple. You move through a side door into what looks like a private dining chamber. The table is small, set for two, with silver platters covered in fine linen. A flagon of wine sits half empty, the dark liquid catching the candlelight in deep crimson glints. You picture Ethelbald here with Judith, voices low, the flicker of the fire dancing on the walls while the rest of the kingdom sleeps, or pretends to. There's a certain intimacy in this space that you can't ignore, and you wonder how many decisions, for better or worse, were made over a quiet meal like this. On the mantel above the hearth there's a carved box of pale ivory. Its lid is inlaid with a scene of a ship at sea, sails full, gulls wheeling above. You've heard that Judith's dowry included fine goods from across the channel, and perhaps this box was one of them, a gift that became a keepsake in her new life, or perhaps it held letters, ones that might have changed the way the court saw their king if they had ever been read aloud. Back in the main hall, the king's seat is empty, but the presence lingers. The rushes on the floor are fresh, the flowers woven into them still bright with colour. You find it oddly telling. Ethelbald was known to be fastidious about appearances, perhaps as a way to keep the court's eyes on the splendour rather than the controversy. If the hall looks grand enough, maybe no one will dare mention the thing everyone's thinking about. Near the window, a court poet is reciting verses to a small group. His voice is smooth, the words rolling in the old West Saxon tongue. You catch a few phrases: honour, loyalty, love unending, and you wonder if this is flattery paid for in coin or in something more personal. In medieval courts, poets often walked the fine line between chronicler and propagandist, and their verses could be as much about rewriting reputations as celebrating them. Historians still debate whether the poems from Ethelbald's court were genuine praise or carefully crafted image control. As you lean against the cool stone, you notice a servant slipping through the far door, balancing a tray with a single goblet and a covered dish. The direction he's headed, toward the private apartments, makes you think the king is enjoying a quieter evening tonight, maybe with Judith, maybe not. The court will speculate either way. Outside, the night wind presses against the shutters, and you can hear the faint patter of rain. It makes the chamber feel even more enclosed, the firelight more precious. You take a slow breath and imagine what it must have been like to live in this kind of constant watchfulness, not just from your subjects, but from your own kin. A royal scandal wasn't just personal, it was political dynamite, the kind that could topple alliances and invite enemies to test the throne's strength. And yet, Ethelbald held his crown. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of the match that kept challengers at bay. If he could break this taboo and still command the throne, what else was he capable of? Or maybe the court found it easier to accept what they couldn't change, focusing instead on the daily flow of feasts, hunts and councils. After all, every king had his peculiarities, and as long as the realm was stable, some were willing to let the rest slide. Before you leave the chamber, your eyes catch on a small detail. The curtain by the side door is embroidered with two entwined vines, their leaves and flowers so tangled you can't see where one ends and the other begins. You wonder if it's a subtle nod to the union that defined Ethelbald's reign, or just a pattern chosen by an oblivious artisan. Either way, it feels like the room is in on the secret, and now so are you. You step back into the hallway, the faint hum of conversation reaching you from another part of the palace. Somewhere ahead, another story waits, and you find yourself drawn toward it, the scandal of Ethelbald's court still warm in your mind, like the last sip of spiced wine lingering on the tongue. You pace past heavy tapestries flecked with gold thread, their hunting scenes rippling as the night breeze sidles through a cracked window, and you feel the court of Louis the Quarrelsome tightening around you like a finely laced doublet. You can almost hear the creak of saddles and the nervous laughter of nobles trying to look brave under the torchlight. The floor smells faintly of crushed time, someone's attempt at deodorizing a century of secrets. And you make a mental note that medieval interior design is basically candles, fabric, and plausible deniability. Louis X stands at the center of this tension, a young king whose temper and pride earn him the nickname the Quarrelsome, and whose private life glows like a coal under the ash of politics. The mainstream history is as sharp as a drawn blade. The scandal now woven through every whisper here is the Tour de Nesle affair, the accusation that the king's own wife, Margaret of Burgundy, and two sisters-in-law betrayed their husbands with a pair of handsome knights. The rumour starts, as so many do, with a gift, embroidered purses that two careless men flaunt in the wrong wine-thick tavern, and it careens toward disaster. You walk along the shadowed wall and feel the shiver that must have run through Paris when the arrests came. The lovers are tortured and executed. The accused queens are confined. Margaret is shut away in the chill of Chateau Gaillard, and you picture frost biting the iron lattice of her window. You turn a corner and find a gallery lined with practice weapons and dented tournament shields, and the court's heartbeat shifts from scandal to sport. Louis loves contests, tilts, archery, and that ancestor of tennis, jeu de paume, with linen balls thudding against walls polished smooth by too many ambitions. The clank of a half-buckled breastplate reminds you even pleasure here has a tactical edge when needed. Obel's crash lances, they don't just compete, they test alliances. You watch a squire chalk a line on the floor and think of the invisible lines Louis draws between friend and foe, between those who feign ignorance and those who know far too much. In a side alcove, a page oils a tournament helm that still smells of sweat and rain. He hums a tune that turns mischievous as he slips a silk kerchief inside the visor. For luck, he grins, and you don't ask who scented it. The court's quirky tidbits bloom like night flowers. A rumour says a certain lady uses threads of gold in her hairnet, so no one can tug it loose without leaving evidence. Another insists the best players of jeu de paume keep spare shoes warmed by the hearth so their feet never cramp mid-rally. You nod as if this is a universal athletic truth, right up there with stretch and don't drink 3 goblets before serving. At the far end of the gallery, a narrow door brings you into a smaller chamber where strategy replaces spectacle. A map of the royal domain lies unrolled, pins dotted over towns that pay the king's taxes and over forests reserved for his hunts. Here's a fact that doesn't fit the tabloid tone. In 1315, Louis issues an ordinance offering freedom to serfs on his domain in exchange for payment, the sort of dry-sounding administrative move that can quietly alter lives. You run your fingers a hair's breadth above the parchment and imagine a peasant's first steps as a free tenant. No fireworks, just a calmer heartbeat and a field that finally feels like it belongs to the hands that seed it. Historians still argue whether the ordinance sprang from moral intent, fiscal need, or a canny blend of both. Power rarely moves for one reason only, especially in this house of mirrors. The scandal's aftershocks slither back into the room. You catch a whisper: Margaret's imprisonment, her death in 1315, and Louis's swift remarriage to Clementia of Hungary. The candles gutter as if startled by the pace of it all. The new queen arrives with grace and pedigree, and you picture a ceremony as careful as clockwork, each vow a political stitch. If you listen closely, you can hear jewellery settling against velvet. Yes, even the jewels are nervous. You also hear the gossip that the king's anger is like summer thunder, loud, sudden, and occasionally followed by an awkward apology involving an expensive falcon. You decide the falcon is the medieval equivalent of "I got you flowers." It squawks more but lasts longer. You drift toward an arched window, its stone chill seeping into your palms, and look down over the Seine. Somewhere beyond the roofs lies the Tour de Nesle itself, that blunt tower in the city's memory where the rumour took root. A boat glides past on the water. You imagine late-night messages ferried under the bridge, couriers ducking their heads as if conspiracy were a low doorway. A fringed tidbit floats up. Someone claims there was a coded knot in a lady's girdle, tied left for safe, right for meat, and double for danger. You smile. Human ingenuity invests even ribbon with suspense. Historians still argue whether such signals really directed trysts, or whether later storytellers stitched them into the tale like flashy embroidery on a plain cuff. The air thickens with the memory of a summer game. Louis strips down to a linen shirt for jeu de paume. The walls thump, the ball skims, and sweat beads along his brow. He wins a rally, or maybe loses, it's hard to tell with kings, then reaches for a cup of chilled wine. Here's the uncertain hinge of his short reign. The oft-repeated story says that cold drink after furious play sows the seed of the illness that kills him in 1316. The drier counterpoint says it's pleurisy or pneumonia. You step back from the window and let both possibilities hang in the air like two banners in the same draft. If you're keeping score at home, medicine versus myth is currently tied. In the corridor again, laughter spikes and dies as courtiers notice you. You pass a table strewn with tiny gift purses, their cords braided in red and blue. The symbolism is dangerously on the nose. You resist the urge to say, maybe switch to a gift card. This is where the first whispers began. After all, with two knights flashing trinkets they shouldn't have had. One of the purses lies open, empty, and you swear the absence itself stares back at you. A herald strides past, practicing proclamations under his breath, and you catch another fact bobbing in his wake. The king allows the return of Jews to France in 1315 under strict conditions, a pragmatic gesture threaded with revenue concerns and cautious tolerance. Policies like these don't fit neatly into a romance or a scandal. They live in the ledger and the courtroom and the market square where the day's true weather is set. Historians still argue whether Louis's reforms were coherent policy or a series of jolts from a restless ruler trying to steady the throne while it rocked under him. As you pivot toward the Great Hall, a tournament trumpet blares and every conversation snaps to attention. Nobles drift toward the balconies to watch practice bouts under lanterns. A knight salutes with his lance, then promptly drops his shield, and the scattered applause sounds like a bag of walnuts meeting a floor. You feel the court exhale. Thank goodness for slapstick. Medieval PSA, always strap the shield before you show off. A lady nearby mutters that the best duel is a legal one, preferably one you win without lifting a finger. Wise words in a house where signatures can be deadlier than swords. The night deepens. You brush the tapestry as you pass, notice that the weaver has hidden strawberries among the oak leaves, a private joke perhaps, or a symbol of temptation tucked where only a bored mind at midnight would find it. Your shoulder remembers the earlier corridors and that toppled ivory knight. Your nose remembers the rosemary strewn under King John's feet. Your ears carry the hush around Ethelbald's controversial vows. The courts are different, but the gravity is the same. Desire tugs at power. Power pretends not to be tugged. Everyone else learns to walk without tripping over the hem of rumour. When you finally pause beside the throne dais, the seat itself looms like a challenge. Louis's crown glints on its stand, looking heavier than any strong neck deserves. You can almost feel the way he wears it, jaw set, eyes quick, a man who likes the game and fears the cost. Somewhere in the palace, a scribe dots the last I on an ordinance, while, somewhere else, a page tugs a ribbon twice, hoping it means what the storybooks say. And you, steadying your breath, realize the trap in these halls is not a spike pit or a hidden wire. It's a web of glances that never forget. A guard coughs, a candle gutters, and the hush reforms as if the room prefers its secrets snug. Would you ease away from the throne, letting the darkness fold back, and follow the thread of footsteps that leads out, on to the next echo, the next corridor, the next place where velvet covers thorns and history pretends it's not blushing? You hover by a fire that burns low and steady, flames licking at a blackened log like a cat washing a paw, and the chamber smells of cinnamon, pepper, and a whisper of clove. This isn't a cook fire so much as a signal. Tonight is for late council and later appetites. You're in the orbit of Charles II of Navarre, Charles the Bad, whose name enters a room 5 minutes before he does and checks the exits. The table at your elbow holds trenchers still glistening with sauce, plates of quince, and a jug wearing a napkin like a modest little hat. The servants move without clatter, trained to make silence feel luxurious. Somewhere behind a curtain, a lute tickles a tune meant to sound accidental. The mainstream fact drifts in like smoke. In 1354, Charles's quarrel with King John II of France exploded in the assassination of the king's favourite, Charles de la Cerda, stabbed in his bed, the sort of outcome that turns a rumour into a policy crisis. You picture the shock rolling down Paris streets, lanterns bobbing like confused fireflies, while messengers ride with faces set to "We told you this would happen." From then on, Charles the Bad keeps his hands busy, in truces, betrayals, and the kind of alliances you write with ink that's already half erased. He is King of Navarre by blood. His mother, Joan II, wore that crown, Count of Evreux by inheritance, and a chronic headache to any French ruler who prefers their vassals predictable. A servant passes with a dish of roasted capon, the skin lacquered to a shine that would make a modern food stylist cry gentle tears. Yes, the midnight feast is real enough. Charles keeps odd hours, convening council when rivals sleep. The fringe tidbit lands on your tongue like spice. There's a chronicler's whisper that Charles sometimes dined late on sweet wine steeped with herbs to clear the head, which, given the volume of plotting here, could do bubble as brain detergent. Another rumour says he had a weakness for candied peel served warm, the way some of us have a weakness for just one more episode. You give the candied peel a look that says, "We both know this is not the last slice." You step closer to the hearth and feel how the room is arranged like a trick, chairs angled for private asides, maps placed to invite a lingering finger, the fire set low enough that faces fall into shadows if the talk turns sharp. Charles glides in at last, slender, alert, the kind of man who smiles as if he's fitting the grin to your intentions. Historians still argue whether his reputation for malice was earned or constructed by enemies. Le Mauvais can slide from wicked to ill-fated to troublesome, depending on whose ink you trust. What no one disputes is his appetite for leverage. He will play England against France so often you half expect a bill for courtside seats at the 100 Years' War. On the wall hangs a tapestry of a hunt, all antlers and hounds and triumphant horns, but tucked low in the border, you spot strawberries amid oak leaves. Remember those from Louis's gallery? the weaver's quiet wink that temptation grows where power pretends not to look. You think of that knight you saw toppled beside a queen on an ivory board. The game here is the same, only played with provinces. Charles's claim to the French crown isn't strong enough to wear, but it hangs in his wardrobe where everyone can see the colour. He married Jeanne, daughter of King John II of France, useful embroidery on an already complicated coat. The room exhales as a messenger is ushered in, boots dusted with the road. The Dauphin, future Charles V, has opinions, as usual. Tonight's letter is bland on the surface, all bows and courtesies. But the subtext prowls. Keep your men quiet in Normandy. Keep your knives sheathed in Paris. Keep your hand out of the English till. You watch Charles tilt his head as he reads, the way a falcon tests wind with a wingtip. The debate among scholars rises like steam. Was Charles a genius of opportunism or a gambler who mistook luck for strategy? He made treaties, mantes valognes, then undid them like knots you tug loose with your teeth. He was imprisoned by the Dauphin in 1356, escaped in 1357 because of course he did, and stoked the Paris upheavals alongside Etienne Marcel when the moment smelled ripe. A platter arrives with something glossy and dark, prunes stewed in wine with a twist of orange. The scent punches like a delightful pillow. You savour a breath and remember the rosemary rushes under King John's feet and the silver hand mirror with its swan neck handle. Courts advertise themselves with perfume and shine while their real business crawls under the tablecloth. Charles dabs his lips with a linen square, then traces a route on a map with that napkin still in hand, as if to say, diplomacy is messy. Keep a towel. Light joke number 1, you resist offering him a pack of medieval wet wipes. There's laughter from the side table, low, edged. Someone has told the story of Charles de Lacerda's end, with the slightly too merry tone people use when they want to pretend horror is just an anecdote with better lighting. You note how the king lets the laugh live, then snips it short with a look. The mainstream fact sharpens again. Violence wasn't a rumour in this court. It was a lever. When the lever stuck, Charles found a different one, sometimes English, sometimes French, sometimes Navarrese, sometimes purely Charles. You're handed a cup of Hippocras, spiced wine warmed until the cinnamon smiles. A clerk nearby mutters about coin, about garrisons, about the price of loyalty measured in winter fodder. Historians still argue whether Charles's schemes drained Navarre to feed his French games or whether his cross-border chess kept the small kingdom relevant in a world of bristling giants. You listen to the scrape of quill on parchment and the soft thud of wax impressed by a seal, tiny sounds that decide whether men march at dawn. The quirky tidbit flares again in the shadows. Someone claims Charles kept a perfumed brazier in his private chamber to mask the smell of alchemical trials. Little glass alembics warming like captive moons while he chased a tonic for vigour or longevity. Maybe. Or maybe the brazier was just for comfort in draughty stone. As with those ribbon signals at Louis's court, you file it under plausible mischief, delightful whether true or not. Light joke number 2. If an influencer today titled a video, "I tried medieval longevity elixirs," you'd click. Don't lie. A scribe reads out a list of names that glimmer with future trouble. You pick out English captains, French cousins, Norman barons with tempers like lightning. The door opens to chill night and the draught makes the fire bow. Even the flames flatter. You recall the shield that clattered from a show-off's arm and think how Charles never forgets to strap his guard is gossip, his strap is deniability. When cornered, he can turn a corridor into a maze, a dinner into a treaty into a trap door. And then, as if the room has waited for your attention to wander, the final famous, morbid anecdote pads in on soft feet. The story of Charles's death in 1387, wrapped in linen soaked with spirits for a medical cure, and, so the tale goes, a careless spark sets the king alight. It is the most quoted end because it is theatrical, a punishment that writes itself, the bad burned by his own remedy. Historians still argue whether this is apocryphal or embroidered from a humbler mishap. Either way, it lingers because it fits the script too neatly. The man who loved midnight fires goes out like a wick. Light joke number 3. You have the sudden, wildly inappropriate urge to add, "Do not try this at home," in Latin. You lean closer to the coals and imagine how many nights like this stacked into a reign. Feasts that became parliaments, parliaments that became threats, threats that became marriages, all while the maps breathed under fingertips. Charles's cloak, and it is a fine one, fur-lined, heavy, indulgent, swings as he rises, and you see the dagger at his belt, ordinary, practical, not the jeweled kind you display for ceremony. Cloak, dagger. The summary writes itself, but it misses the texture of candied peel and whispered letters and candles pressed deliberately low. At the door, you pause and look back. The stew glows, the wine inks the cups. The napkin sits folded like a white flag that nobody here believes in. You slip into the corridor where the floor stones hold the day's heat and the night's secrets, and you swear you can still taste the clove on your tongue, sweet, sharp, and a little dangerous, like a promise made while everyone pretends it's only dessert. You trace the cold marble with your fingertips and feel how the stone answers like a held breath. This palace likes its secrets sober. The torches gutter lower here, as if even the flames know to be discreet in the presence of a king whose beauty is a blade, Philip the Fair. The nickname is no flattery fluff. It arrives at the eye like a snow-bright morning, pale, precise, and a little dangerous to stare at too long. You move through a corridor where the walls wear carved lilies, and the chill smells faintly of beeswax, ink, and new-minted coin. It is the perfume of administration, which sounds dull until you remember how power purrs when ruled by ledgers and law. He is not a riotous host like some of the others you've met tonight. He is the quiet in a room that makes everyone else speak more carefully. In the antechamber, the cushions are stiff, the drapery disciplined. Even the rushes crunch with restraint. Still, whispered nights accumulate around Philip the way frost accumulates on a window, subtle, persistent, and sometimes forming patterns you could swear are messages. The mainstream fact clenches the air. Before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, his officers move through France like a net, arresting the Knights Templar, men famed for piety and warcraft, on charges of heresy, indecency, and other dark mutterings. You feel the tremor run under the flagstones as their houses are sealed, their coffers catalogued, their bodies marched into the narrow glare of accusation. You pass a table set with writing implements so handsome they look like they could sign ordinances by themselves. Cut quills, smooth pumice, seals that flash tiny heraldic animals when the candle bends toward them. A clerk is drying parchment with sand. The faint hiss brings goose flesh to your arms. The king's taste runs to precision. It's why the court learned fast to stop oversharing, yet rumours still breed in tidy corners. Did Philip's night run on calculations alone, or did he keep private curiosities, a cabinet of oddities small enough to hide in a prayer box? Someone swears he asked an astrologer to choose auspicious hours for delicate moves, the stars acting like a second chancery. Historians still argue whether that night assault on the Templars was a spiritual crusade against corruption or a fiscal thunderbolt aimed at order, land, and liquid coin. Beyond the screens, a brazier breathes scented smoke. Not the riot of cinnamon and clove you tasted in Navarre, but the quieter pride of frankincense, with a barely sweet shadow that suggests orange rind. A lady-in-waiting passes wearing gloves faintly perfumed, a court fad that leaves every handshake scented like a secret. Light joke number 1, it's the medieval version of greets you and leaves a trail of expensive candle store. You think of those strawberries the weavers kept hiding in leaf borders and glimpse a few stitched here too. Tiny rubies under the fleur-de-lis, as if temptation insists on photobombing piety. Tapestries report battles by day, but night tells you Philip's heart beats loudest for order. He loves the hunt. Yes, that mainstream image of him coursing stags in Fontainebleau is true enough. But he loves the orderly parade that precedes the hunt even more. Dogs ranked, horns tuned, horses gleaming, hawks hooded like monks with talons. You approach a stand and see a falconer's kit hanging there, hoods neat as folded letters. The fringed tidbit rises, faint and tantalizing. A courtesan once claimed the king kept a white gerfalcon gifted by northern merchants, and that he stroked the bird's chest feathers when thinking through tax codes, as if raptor wisdom translated to revenue. Historians still argue whether such details are pillow talk inventions or real habits that slipped past the shut. Terse. A door opens to a narrower room where a gilded Madonna watches over velvet-lined boxes of relics and rings, piety arranged with a collector's eye. The gold is a winter sun on the wall, and the hush suggests prayers still unspooled in the air. You consider the puzzle, a sovereign stern about ceremony, rigorous with churchly forms, yet unafraid to break the back of a papal challenge. The conflict with Boniface VIII scratches at the door like a fox. Anagni, 1303, the Pope slapped, or not. Historians still argue whether the famous slap was a literal blow or a metaphor polished by later pens. The pontiff dying weeks later, Philip's chill authority undented. Soon Clement V, French and careful, will sit in Avignon rather than Rome. Some call that exile the king's shadow, others call it administrative accident. Either way, the papacy's orbit shifts, and you can feel the gravitational tug in the marrow. The night servant brings a small tray, almonds blanched in rosewater, a jug of barely warmed wine, and curiously a shallow dish of crushed violets made into a paste. Cosmetics at court? Of course. Nobles dab scent on linen to sweeten winter air. A few even tint lips, not for seduction exactly, more for the theatre of health in an age of candlelight. You recall your earlier inventory of wardrobes and mirrors and smirk. Light joke number 2. Somewhere a monk is writing a treatise titled On the Moral Ambiguity of Violet Lip Balm. The paste glows faintly. You wonder if any of the king's private curiosities were really this simple, small comforts that softened the edge of relentless calculus. But the calculus is relentless. A treasurer at the far table counts clipped coins, muttering about debasement and exchange. Under Philip, the mint does not sleep, the coinage shifts, value flexes, and markets sputter like wet candles. It is not romantic, but it is power. People compete. Lay in every century that money feels funny. Here the complaint grows teeth. A fat ledger lies open, the numbers marching in ink that shines like beetle shell. Historians still argue whether Philip's financial pressure sprang from necessity, wars, administration, image, or appetite, a ruler's habit grown into policy. If silver can be squeezed, squeeze it. You step nearer the window and catch your reflection layered over Paris roofs. Your face floats on black tile like a mask trying to learn patience. The city breathes below, carts creaking, vintners singing, gossip darting across bridges as nimble as cats. In that gossip, the Templars' confessions hiss, obscene rituals denied and recanted, then affirmed under torture. The truth is drowned in methods, as truths often are. You picture Jacques de Molay in 1314, bound to the stake on the Ile de la Cité, the smoke climbing the same sky that once gilded his order's banners. He may have cursed the king and his line. The story fits the ear because the dynasty soon founders, Louis X dead young, then Philippe V, then Charles IV, Capetian branches snapping in a frost of fate. Curse or coincidence? Historians still argue whether the Templar curse is hindsight theatre or a real chill walking the corridors. You watch the candle lean, even flame enjoys a good ghost story. In a cabinet drawer, no, you're not opening it, you're only imagining. You place a handful of court oddments you've collected tonight. A falcon hood, a violet paste, a single clipped coin, a slip of parchment with an astrologer's hour scribbled in the corner. You realize how easily posterity mistakes the texture of a rain. Call him the Ice King, and you forget the small heat of scented gloves. Call him the destroyer of an order, and you forget the quiet ordinance that standardizes a toll. Call him beautiful, and you miss the iron frame holding the face still. Light. Joke number 3. If resting royal face were a medieval meme, Philip would own the format. A footfall behind you, controlled and soft, and you know a chamberlain is measuring the length of your stay with a glance. This court is courteous but not indulgent. The king respects time the way a jeweler respects facets. Each angle must be exact. You bow yourself out of the small room and back into the broad hall, where the lilies stare you down and the floor remembers every careful shoe. The night is not riotous here. It is trimmed and pressed, desires confined to narrow lanes like water through sluices. But confinement does not mean absence, it means pressure. And pressure, as any mint master can tell you, leaves an impress you can feel with your fingertip long after the die is lifted. You breathe once more of frankincense and ink, carry with you the staccato hush of clerks, the tidy cruelty of paperwork, the sleek glide of a hawk's hood being fitted to a beak that could unmake a hand. When you look back, the room has already sealed itself. Philip's beauty returns to stillness. The strawberries hide again among the leaves, and you keep walking, the shape of a Friday the 13th curled in your pocket like a coin that's both blessing and bruise. You step into a hall warm with flickering firelight, the air thick with the mingled scents of roasted meat, beeswax candles and a faint sweetness, maybe almond pastry cooling somewhere out of sight. The shadows here are softer, almost romantic, and the rhythm of voices is more playful than tense. You've crossed into the court of Alfonso XI of Castile, and if Philip the Fair's world was measured in clipped coins and careful decrees, this one beats to the pulse of two hearts and the politics that come with them. The mainstream fact unfurls like a banner. Alfonso XI is remembered for his long, open relationship with Leonor de Guzman, a noblewoman of striking intelligence and influence even while he remained married to Maria of Portugal. Their connection lasted nearly 2 decades, producing 10 children and no shortage of tension. You can almost feel the divide in the air, 2 courts in one, each with its own constellation of allies, its own orbit of flattery and suspicion. At feasts, they say, Alfonso might sit at the head of one table with Leonor close by, while Maria occupied another, the formal queen amid courtiers who smiled a little too politely. Historians still argue whether Alfonso's devotion to Leonor was purely personal or partly strategic, cementing ties with her powerful family to stabilize his rule. A long trestle table runs the length of the hall, covered in embroidered cloth and lined with goblets of polished silver. You notice the small details, napkins folded into elaborate shapes, pictures etched with the castle's crest. The seating arrangements are precise, each guest's place reflecting their loyalty and current favour. You can see how one evening's choice of who sits near the king could ripple into weeks of whispered conjecture. A minstrel strums a soft melody in the corner, the kind that lets conversation rise and fall without strain. You pass a pies of ladies-in-waiting murmuring about a recent hunt, their words sprinkled with names you don't recognise but which clearly carry weight. One tilts her head toward the dais where Alfonso lounges, his gaze fixed on someone across the room. You follow it, and it lands on Leonor, her gown a deep crimson that catches the firelight, her smile quick but knowing. The fringe tidbit comes as you drift past the servant's door. Someone claims Alfonso once had a small private garden planted to mimic the scent of Leonor's perfume, so he could walk there and feel her presence when she was away. It sounds like the sort of story that could be invention, yet you can't quite dismiss it. A space designed purely for memory and desire fits the warmth of this court and its undercurrent of indulgence. Light joke number 1. Imagine explaining to the royal gardener, no, not just roses, roses that smell like her. You step into a smaller side room where a map of the Iberian Peninsula lies, spread across a heavy table, small carved markers denoting troop positions and fortified towns. This is where the playful surface of the court gives way to hard strategy. Alfonso's reign is defined by the Reconquista, the push against Muslim-held territories, culminating in his victory at the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340. You run your hand just above the map's surface, tracing the imagined march of soldiers across the dusty plains of Andalusia. Historians still argue whether his military focus was sharpened by the stability Leonor's companionship provided, or if the personal drama of his court distracted from more urgent matters. The firelight in here is lower, pooling in shadows between the markers. Alfonso's hand rests on one, his fingers drumming absently as he listens to a captain's report. You can almost hear the hum of calculation in the air, the balancing of ambition against resources. In this light, the king's charm feels like another weapon in his arsenal, one he wields as readily in war councils as in Leonor's company. Back in the main hall, the feast is in full swing. Platters of roasted lamb and bowls of saffron rice are carried in by servants whose faces shine from the heat of the kitchens. A jug of deep red wine is poured into your cup before you can protest, the aroma rich and heady. You take a sip and feel the warmth spread through you, loosening the edges of the court's formality. A jester tumbles in the centre of the floor, his bells jingling, drawing laughter from both tables. But you can tell the laughter is just a little different depending on which side it comes from. At one point a messenger arrives, dust on his boots and urgency in his eyes. He bows to Alfonso, presents a sealed letter and withdraws. The king breaks the seal and reads quickly, his expression tightening for just a moment before smoothing over. He gestures to a scribe, murmurs instructions, and then resumes his place as if nothing has happened. You realise this is part of the performance. Never let the court see the crack in the mask. Light joke number 2. Medieval kings, like modern customer service reps, must master the "everything is fine" face. You wander toward the far end of the hall, where a large tapestry depicts the Virgin Mary sheltering a host of knights under her mantle. The weave is fine, the colours still vivid, and you suspect it serves as more than decoration. In a court where the king's personal life is a constant point of discussion, pious imagery doubles as a shield, a reminder that the ruler's authority is divinely sanctioned, even if his affections are more worldly. The night stretches on, and you notice that while the music swells and the laughter flows, certain glances are exchanged that speak of deeper currents. A nod here, a raised eyebrow there, signals between allies in this ongoing courtly balancing act. You think of the silver hand mirror in King John's court, the hidden strawberries in Louis's tapestry, the falcon hood in Philip's cabinet. Here, the symbol might be a shared toast, held just a second too long. The quirky tidbit finds you near the exit. A servant whispers that Leonor sometimes sent Alfonso notes written in lemon juice, visible only when held near a flame, so they could pass under the eyes of watchful courtiers. You smile at the ingenuity, half romance, half espionage. Historians still argue whether any such notes survive in archives. Their words faded to ghostly traces. Light joke number 3, the medieval equivalent of "delete our chat after reading." As you leave the warmth of the hall for the cooler corridor, you carry with you the layered atmosphere of Alfonso's court, the laughter of feasts, the charged glances across a room, the scent of a garden grown for memory, the rustle of a map where battles are plotted in miniature. Power and passion here are not rivals. They sit at the same table, drink from the same cup, and smile for the same audience. You step into a hall where the light feels slightly dimmer, as if the flames themselves have been drinking, and the air is rich with smoke and the heady scent of mulled wine. The laughter here is bigger, rounder, less courtly precision, more the belly-deep roar of people who have forgotten tomorrow exists. You've found your way into the court of Vladislav II, known in some circles as the Drunkard, and the atmosphere hits you like a warm, spiced fog. The mainstream fact sets the scene. Vladislav II of Bohemia and Hungary, though often politically cautious, was also remembered for his fondness for lavish feasts and excessive drinking, to the point where diplomatic meetings could dissolve into extended revels. Historians still argue whether his reputation for drunkenness was exaggerated by political enemies, or whether the stories of days-long banquets and forgotten councils have a solid grain of truth. Either way, you can smell the ale on the breath of this court before you even cross the threshold. The long tables are heavy with food, wild boar glazed to a caramel sheen, wheels of cheese cracked open to reveal pale, creamy interiors, and trenchers stacked with thick slices of bread still steaming from the oven. Every few moments a servant hurries past with a jug the size of a small child, sloshing dark beer into waiting mugs. Someone shouts a toast from the far end, and the roar that answers is loud enough to make the rafters shiver. Near the dais, Vladislav sits broad-shouldered and flushed, his crown tilted at an angle that suggests it has slipped more than once tonight. He raises a goblet, ornate enough to double as a weapon, and drinks deeply before turning to speak to the man at his left, his words lost in the wave of noise that crashes around you. You catch only fragments, something about a treaty, something about a horse race, and then laughter that spills over love. Ike the foam in his cup. The fringed tidbit sidles up to you in the form of a servant carrying a tray of tiny pastries filled with minced venison and dried cherries. She leans in and mutters that the king once ordered a fountain in the courtyard to flow with wine for an entire feast day. Whether it actually happened or just lives in the mouths of storytellers, you can picture it too easily. Guests dunking their cups straight into the stream, pigeons looking mildly bewildered as they tried to land for a sip. Light joke number 1. Somewhere a medieval health official is clutching their head in despair. You wander toward a side room, expecting quiet, but find a dice game in full swing. Nobles in fine cloaks lean over a low table, coins scattered across the surface like fallen leaves. The clatter of dice against wood punctuates bursts of groans and cheers. Vladislav's fondness for gambling is no secret. Historians still argue whether it was harmless entertainment or a reckless habit that strained the treasury. Tonight, at least, the stakes seem more about bragging rights than ruin. The main hall grows hotter as the feast wears on. Sweat gleams on brows, and the air smells of roasted meat, beer, and the faint sharpness of spilled vinegar. You sidestep a group of men locked arm in arm, swaying as they belt out a song about a fox who outwits a farmer. A favourite in taverns and apparently here too. The chorus is easy enough that you hum along, though you suspect you've joined in a verse about something less polite. A herald appears briefly, trying to deliver a message, but he's waved away with a laugh and a refill. You watch him retreat, expression carefully blank. Here's the heart of the tension in Vladislav's court. Governance and indulgence share the same table, but the wine flows faster than the ink. A council session postponed for a feast might seem harmless once or twice, but alliances can sour like casks left open too long. Back near the dais, Vladislav is telling a story, his hands painting the air in wide sweeps. The people nearest him laugh so hard they nearly spill their drinks, and you find yourself wishing you could catch every word. But the king speaks quickly, and the accent of his Czech inflection rolls over the words like a wave, leaving you with only the sense of warmth, charm, and a certain recklessness. Light joke number 2, if charisma could be bottled, they'd be serving it by the pint here. The quirky tidbit finds you by the musician's corner, where a young piper whispers between songs that the king once attempted to outdrink an entire visiting delegation from Poland. According to the piper, he succeeded, but only by having his cup quietly refilled with watered wine after the first few rounds. True or not, the image of a monarch leaning on sleight of hand to win a drinking contest fits perfectly with the mix of pride and play in the room. Historians still argue whether this is a harmless anecdote or a sign of a ruler too facile, accused on appearances. As the night deepens, the music shifts to faster tunes, and the floor in front of the dais becomes a dance space. Boots thump, skirts whirl, and the king himself joins in, crown set aside, moving with surprising agility for someone so deep in his cups. The crowd cheers every turn, every bow, every slightly wobbly step. You can't help but smile. Whatever else is true about him, Vladislav knows how to keep a court's spirits high. You slip out through a side door into a cooler passageway, the echoes of laughter and music trailing after you. The air out here is sharp with the scent of pine from branches hung for the feast, a reminder that winter presses at the palace walls. In the quiet, you think about the balance a king like Vladislav has to strike. The joy of shared celebration against the risk of letting governance dissolve into the bottom of a cup. Somewhere behind you, a toast rings out again, louder than the last, and you imagine the goblets lifting, the wine spilling just a little onto the tablecloth, and the warm, unsteady camaraderie holding for one more night. It's easy to see why some remembered him fondly and others as a cautionary tale. Both perhaps are true. You push through a set of heavy double doors that creak like they've been asked one favour too many, and the scent that greets you is less banquet, more stale air laced with a faint tang of ale. The light is thin here, the torches spaced wider apart, leaving whole stretches of wall in shadow. This is Prague, or more precisely, the neglected heart of it, the palace of Wenceslaus IV, the so-called lazy king, whose habits keep more doors shut than open. The mainstream fact ambles in without hurry. Wenceslaus ruled as King of Bohemia from 1378 and later as King of the Romans, but his reign was marked by political inertia, long absences from public affairs, and an unfortunate tendency to leave governance to others while he enjoyed the comforts of seclusion. He was deposed as King of the Romans in 1400 for being negligent in the administration of the empire. Historians still argue whether this was outright sloth or a deliberate withdrawal from a political arena he found intolerable. The corridor slopes slightly, leading you toward a chamber where the sound of muffled voices filters through a thick oak door. You push it open and find a room more suited to an afternoon nap than a council meeting. Heavy drapes shut out most of the daylight, and the hearth is banked low, casting an amber gloom. A few low tables are cluttered with tankards and half-finished goblets, a scattering of dice, and a chessboard frozen mid-game. In one corner, Wenceslaus himself reclines in a carved chair padded with furs, a flagon within arm's reach. He's not dressed in full regalia, no crown, no formal robes, just a fine but rumpled tunic, the kind that suggests he had no intention of being seen by the broader court today. He lifts the flagon lazily, takes a drink and glances toward the door with a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance, as if visitors are an interruption to the main business of Sankt. Lying comfortable, the fringe tidbit drifts to you from a servant adjusting a tapestry. Wenceslaus reportedly kept the doors to his chambers locked for long stretches, admitting only a small circle of companions. On some days, it's said, the only way to reach him was to pass through an antechamber where wine was served continuously, so that anyone waiting would either grow mellow or wander off entirely. Light joke number one, it's basically the medieval version of an out-of-office email that keeps refilling your wine glass. You move past a table near the hearth where a deck of playing cards lies scattered. A closer look reveals the edges are worn smooth from use. Gambling in this room feels less like a vice and more like a pastime to keep the hours from clumping together. The cards themselves are painted with faded gold details, little crowns, chalices, swords and coins, each suit worn down in different places, perhaps from the king favouring certain games over others. In the corner, a hound stirs from its nap and pads over to Wenceslaus, who scratches its ears absent-mindedly while listening to a soft-spoken man read from a ledger. The king nods occasionally, though whether he's absorbing the information or just marking time until the man stops talking is hard to say. Historians still argue whether Wenceslaus's governance suffered from genuine indifference or from being boxed in by nobles who found him easier to manage when he stayed distracted. The air in here is warm but heavy, and you step into an adjoining room to breathe more freely. This smaller chamber is lined with cabinets of glassware, goblets, and ornate pictures, many of them gifts from foreign envoys. You run your fingers along the rim of a crystal cup, cool and smooth, and imagine the quiet pleasure of collecting such things. The quirky tidbit surfaces here. One courtier claimed the king would sometimes choose his drinkware based on the astrological sign of the day, insisting certain shapes tasted better under certain stars. Historians still argue if this was an actual belief or a convenient excuse to avoid using a chipped goblet he disliked. Light joke number 2. Sorry, can't drink from that one. It's a waning moon, and I'm not in the mood for bad luck. Back in the main room, you notice the floor strewn with rushes in need of replacing. They've gone flat and lost their scent. No one here seems to mind. The conversation hums along at a slow pace, punctuated by the occasional clink of metal on wood as a tankard is set down. You watch the king gesture lazily toward the dice on the table, and a companion sweeps them up, shaking them in a cup before rolling them across the surface. The outcome earns a smile from Wenceslaus, not a broad grin, just a faint curve of the lips, but in this quiet court it's enough to signal amusement. As the day outside fades toward evening, a steward appears at the door, bowing and murmuring about a matter requiring the king's attention. Wenceslaus tilts his head, as if weighing whether it's worth the effort to rise. After a pause, he waves a hand in a gesture that could mean, handle it yourself, or later. The steward bows again and retreats, the door closing with a soft thud. The moment passes without comment and the room settles back into its gentle stupor. The smell of wine deepens as a servant tops up the flagon, and the king leans back, stretching his legs toward the fire. The flames catch in his hair for an instant, turning it gold before the shadows reclaim it. You think about how power can be exercised in bursts, loud, decisive moments, but here it's more like a tide that ebbs until it's barely felt at all. Light joke number 3. If procrastination were a sport, Wenceslaus would have a coat of arms for it. You leave the chamber and step into the dim corridor, the muted laughter and clink of dice fading behind you. In the distance, you hear the faint ring of a blacksmith's hammer and the murmur of the city beyond the palace walls. It's a reminder that while the court drifts in comfortable haze, life outside keeps its sharper edge. Walking away, you carry the impression of a reign conducted from behind closed doors, where loyalty is measured in who you allow past the locks, and politics is something that can wait until the next drink is finished. It's a slower world, but one that still shapes the realm, sometimes simply by leaving it to others. You lean on the rail of a broad balcony, the night air damp with sea salt, the sky above brushed with clouds that look like torn parchment. Below you, waves slap the timbers of a moored ship, steady as a heartbeat. The wind carries the scent of brine, tar, and the faint tang of fish drying in the harbour. This is no accidental view. You're in the court of Eric of Pomerania, King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, a man who often traded palace intrigue for the restless horizon. The mainstream fact comes in like the tide. Eric, crowned in the early 15th century as ruler of the Kalmar Union, was ambitious but plagued by political disputes. Known for heavy taxation and conflicts with the Hanseatic League, he was eventually deposed in Denmark and Sweden, retreating to the island fortress of Visborg on Gotland. Historians still argue whether his frequent sea voyages were tactical escapes from dangerous courts or indulgent adventures to avoid the grind of governance. Either way, the result was the same: an absent king, more often seen on a ship than on his throne. You step back from the balcony into a chamber where sea charts are pinned to the walls, edges curled from salt air. A large table holds a model of a warship, sails taut, tiny cannons gleaming. The wood smells faintly of pine tar and oil, as though the craftsman couldn't quite leave the shipyard behind. You imagine Eric here late at night, tracing routes with one calloused finger, eyes drifting toward far-off ports while affairs of state waited back on shore. A fringe tidbit breezes your way from a grizzled ship's master warming himself by the fire. He claims the king once disguised himself as a merchant to slip into a Hanseatic port and eavesdrop on their dealings. Whether true or just dockside legend, you can picture Eric with a hood pulled low, leaning against a warehouse beam, pretending to haggle over salted herring, while counting the ships that came and went. Light joke number 1, imagine a king trying not to look suspicious while asking, "So, how's business?" for the 10th time. In the corner, a coffer stands open, revealing bolts of cloth, carved ivory boxes, and strings of amber beads, goods from Baltic trade routes. This court is different from the candlelit intrigues you've walked through before. Here, wealth smells like tarred rope and warm spices, not perfumed gloves. The quirky tidbit comes from a sailor rolling a coil of rope. He swears the king kept a pet falcon on board his flagship, trained to snatch hats from unsuspecting visitors as a prank. Historians still argue whether such stories were invented to make Eric seem more approachable to his crew or whether the falcon truly had a mischievous streak. Back in the main hall, the scent of sea mingles with roasting fish. A banquet is set, but it's nothing like the heavy spreads of inland courts: grilled eel, pickled herring, rye bread, and tankards of ale. The conversation is louder, more raucous, the kind of talk that carries easily over wind and wave. You notice how many of the men and women here wear knives at their belts, as if ready to return to ship at a moment's notice. Eric himself arrives not with the grand procession of other kings, but striding in with a sailor's gait, cloak flaring behind him like a sail catching wind. He greets people with quick claps on the shoulder, his voice carrying across the hall. There's an openness to him that you don't often see in monarchs. It feels less like holding court and more like returning to the crew after a successful voyage. Yet you also catch the flicker of calculation in his eyes when a merchant leans in to whisper something. The sea may be his escape, but it's also his field for power plays. At one point, a messenger enters, bowing low and presenting a sealed scroll. The king cracks the wax, scanning the message quickly before tucking it into his belt. He raises his cup in a toast, says nothing of the contents, and the hall roars in approval. You wonder if it's news from the mainland, perhaps another call for him to return to a throne he's reluctant to sit. Historians still argue whether his long absences were dereliction of duty or deliberate political maneuvers to keep rivals guessing. Later, you wander into a smaller room that feels more like a captain's cabin than a palace chamber. The walls are lined with shelves holding navigation instruments, astrolabes, compasses, hourglasses. A map on the desk is studded with pins marking ports from Bergen to Danzig. The air smells faintly of lamp oil and wet wool, the scent of nights spent planning routes by lantern glow. You run your hand over the smooth wood of the desk and imagine the steady roll of a ship beneath it. The fringe of this court life brushes you again as you hear two sailors arguing about a voyage that supposedly carried the king into the North Sea in pursuit of an English pirate. One insists they caught him, the other says the pirate escaped in a fog bank thick enough to slice with a bread knife. The truth may never be known, but the story is told with enough conviction to feel like part of the king's legend. Light joke number 2. Apparently, in medieval nautical terms, foggy translates to "I'm not admitting I lost him." The night here is different from inland courts. The hall smells of salt, the people move with the sway of decks beneath their feet, and the king's absence from traditional governance feels almost natural. His realm stretches beyond the castle walls, across the shifting waters of trade and war. You can see how some loved him for it, and others cursed him for abandoning the burdens of the crown. As you step back onto the balcony, the wind has shifted, carrying the sound of rigging clinking against masts. The ships rock gently, their lanterns winking like fireflies on the black water. Somewhere in the dark, a gull cries, a lonely note that feels like both invitation and warning, and you can almost hear the king's voice on the wind calling for the crew to make ready, to lift anchor, to chase the horizon one more time. Light joke number 3. You briefly consider that if all else failed, Eric could have made a comfortable living as a cruise director. You step through a pair of carved wooden doors into a room that smells of vellum, beeswax, and a faint trace of rosewater ink. The air feels quieter here, as though it's been trained to hold its breath in respect for words. This is the court of Alfonso V of Aragon, Alfonso the Magnanimous, a king whose love for literature and scholarship was as famous as any battlefield victory. In contrast to the sea-worn corridors of Eric of Pomerania, this space hums with the stillness of a library at midnight. The mainstream fact takes its place neatly on the shelf. Alfonso V, ruling in the first half of the 15th century, was a noted patron of the arts and a voracious reader. His court in Naples became a magnet for poets, humanists, and scholars, part of the flowering of the Renaissance in southern Europe. Historians still argue whether his passion for books was purely intellectual or also a form of political theatre, designed to present himself as a ruler of refined taste and enlightened authority. The long hall is lined with armoires of illuminated manuscripts, their spines stitched in gold thread. You brush your fingers near, not on, the edge of a page displayed open on a stand. The parchment glows faintly under the light of tall candelabras, the text dancing in fine dark ink, margins crowded with painted flowers, saints, and here and there playful rabbits or monkeys peering from behind scrollwork. It's an echo of those hidden strawberries you've seen before, a wink from the artist that even the most solemn text can carry a private joke. A fringe tidbit finds you in the form of a courtier in scholar's robes who quietly admits that the king sometimes held reading councils in bed. Alfonso would prop himself on cushions, a book in one hand dictating thoughts on governance, love, or military tactics between sips of sweetened wine. The courtier swears that once, during a read-in, each of a chivalric romance, the king paused to order the kitchen to prepare a dish mentioned in the story, just to see if it tasted as good as it sounded. Light joke number 1, the medieval equivalent of pausing a cooking show to go raid the fridge. You move into a smaller side chamber where scrolls are stacked in lacquered chests and a globe, still a novelty, stands by the window. The paint on it is bright, the continents slightly warped by the guesses of cartographers who stitched them together from rumour and sailors' tales. Alfonso's fingers have likely traced those coastlines while imagining new routes for trade and conquest. Here's the thing, his appetite for learning didn't stop at poetry or philosophy. He studied law, history, navigation, the knowledge that could strengthen a kingdom as surely as any army. Historians still argue whether this breadth of interest sometimes slowed his decisiveness, as if weighing too many perspectives at once. Back in the main library hall, the fire in the hearth crackles softly, and a clerk reads aloud from Petrarch, his voice measured and low. Alfonso sits nearby, one leg crossed over the other, a thin smile playing at the edges of his mouth. He isn't draped in the heavy regalia of other kings. Tonight, it's a soft doublet in deep blue, the colour of twilight, with a chain of gold at his throat. The crown rests on a nearby table, as though it's merely another object in the room's careful order. The quirky tidbit drifts over with the scent of warm ink. One of the royal scribes confides that the king occasionally hid personal notes in the margins of books before gifting them to trusted allies. These were not grand political secrets, but short, sharp insights, sometimes a line of advice, sometimes a joke. It's said that more than one noble opened a volume on Aristotle only to find a page marked with a wry comment in Alfonso's own hand. Historians still argue whether any of these annotated treasures survive in private collections. A servant appears with a tray of almond biscuits and small cups of dark spiced wine. The king takes one, sets it beside his book, and continues listening without breaking the rhythm of the clerk's voice. There's an ease here, but it's not laziness. It's the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to shout to be obeyed. The courtiers seem attuned to his mood, keeping their movements slow, their conversations in hushed tones. You wander toward a desk near the far wall where a stack of letters waits to be sealed. The top one is addressed to a poet in Florence, the next to a captain in Sicily. This is the bridge between the two halves of Alfonso's reign, the man who corresponded with humanists in the morning and commanded fleets in the afternoon. It's the same table where he might pen a request for a rare manuscript and moments later sign orders for a military campaign. The fringed tidbit reappears in a murmur from a visiting scholar. The king's personal copy of Livy's History of Rome was said to be bound in leather scented with lavender, and he carried it on campaigns, reading it by lamplight in his tent. Whether for comfort or inspiration, it's a telling image. Strategy and literature sharing the same space in his mind. Light joke number 2. A scented book is one way to make sure no one forgets to return it. As the evening ends, the atmosphere here grows even calmer. Outside the tall windows, the city lights of Naples shimmer against the dark bay. Inside, the steady cadence of the reader's voice is like the ticking of a clock, marking time in words instead of minutes. You feel your own breathing slow, lulled by the rhythm. Then, without fanfare, the king raises his hand. The reader stops mid-sentence. Alfonso closes the book on the table beside him and stands, stretching slightly. The court seems to understand this is the signal for the night to end. People begin to rise, collecting their papers and bowing before heading into the corridors beyond. The fire pops softly, sending a brief shower of sparks upward before settling back into embers. You leave the library hall last, glancing back once to see the king still at the desk, sealing one of those letters. His shoulders are relaxed, his focus steady, as though the noise of the world can wait until the ink is dry. It's a different kind of power, less about the roar of the crowd and more about the weight of a signature. Light joke number 3. In another century, Alfonso would have been the kind of ruler who just drops by the university library and stays for 6 hours. The corridor narrows into a vaulted passage that smells faintly of beeswax and roasted almonds, the floor worn smooth by decades of soft-soled shoes shuffling towards celebration. You follow the sound of laughter and the chime of goblets until the space opens into a grand hall that practically hums with anticipation. Here, banners hang from every beam, crimson, gold, and white, each embroidered with some coat of arms, many now joined by marriage. This is the world of Sigismund of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, Croatia, and later Bohemia, a man whose appetite for marriage rivals his appetite for diplomacy. The mainstream fact makes its entrance with a flourish. Sigismund's reign in the 15th century was marked by political complexity, shifting alliances, and no shortage of nuptial strategy. He married twice, first to Mary of Hungary, which secured him that kingdom's throne, and later to Barbara of Scilly, a match that brought its own intrigue. But he was also a central figure in orchestrating multiple high-profile royal weddings to cement alliances across Europe. Historians still argue whether his reliance on marital diplomacy was brilliant statecraft or an overindulgence in pomp that distracted from pressing political needs. The hall before you is dressed for yet another feast. Long tables stacked with sugared fruits, roast peacock with its feathers reattached for display, and loaves of bread shaped into interlocking rings, a nod to the theme of unity. At the high table, a cushion waits beside Sigismund's ornate chair, presumably for his current queen. The air smells of cinnamon, orange peel, and the faint tang of wax dripping from the massive chandeliers overhead. You notice that even the seating reflects diplomacy. Delegations from different realms are placed together just far enough to avoid awkward jabs, but close enough to overhear each other's polite barbs. This is a feast, yes, but also a negotiation disguised as merriment. The fringe tidbit comes from a page carrying a platter of quail eggs dyed in swirling patterns. He leans toward you and whispers that the emperor once proposed 3 separate marriage arrangements for his nieces in a single week, each to a different court, just to see which offer ripened first. Whether or not it's true, it fits the restless, deal-making energy of a man who saw romance less as an affair of the heart and more as a currency to be spent wisely. Light joke number 1. Medieval speed dating, but with dowries and border treaties. From the dais, Sigismund rises, goblet in hand. His hair, famously long and flowing, glints auburn in the candlelight. He begins to speak, his voice smooth and practiced, every sentence rolling towards some note of unity or shared destiny. You watch as courtiers nod along, some perhaps charmed, others calculating the angle. He knows how to work a room, not with jokes or grand gestures, but with the promise of mutual benefit. Behind the hall, a side chamber holds the real machinery of these unions, tables stacked with scrolls, maps and ledgers. A clerk dips his quill, sketching out lines of inheritance, mapping how one match in Austria could shift the balance in Bohemia, how another in Burgundy might ease tensions with France. Here, you can see the truth of it. Marriage as a chess move, with human lives as pieces. Historians still argue whether Sigismund genuinely believed in the romantic language he used, or whether it was all part of the sale. The quirky tidbit emerges from a court musician tuning a lute in the corner. He claims the emperor kept a small casket of love poems, some written by famous poets, others anonymous, that he would gift to brides or grooms at weddings he arranged. According to the musician, one set of verses was so clumsy that it made the recipient laugh out loud at the altar. Whether the emperor knew the quality or simply enjoyed the gesture remains a mystery. Light joke number 2. Roses are red, alliances are 2. Probably didn't make the final cut. You return to the main hall just as dancers begin to take the floor. Sigismund joins in for the opening round, his steps measured but graceful, as though every movement is another line in his ongoing negotiation with the world. You notice how he makes a point of speaking to each guest he passes, sometimes with a light comment, sometimes with a question that clearly has another purpose behind it. At the far end of the table, a messenger arrives, clearly fresh from the road. He bows low, passes a sealed letter to the emperor, and steps back. Sigismund reads quickly, then tucks the letter into his belt without breaking the flow of conversation. It's another deal, another arrangement waiting to be tied off with the right union. The man thrives on it. You can almost see him weighing which ribbon to use for the bow. Fringe tidbit pops up again when a silver-haired noble leans over to confide that the emperor once arranged a wedding feast so large it took 3 full days for all the guests to be served, and by the time the last table was reached, the first was already hungry again. Historians still argue if this is true or merely an exaggeration to convey the scale of his celebrations. Light joke number 3. You hope they at least rotated the dessert course. As the music swells and the wine flows, the atmosphere in the hall grows heady. You can see how easy it would be to be swept up in the charm of it all, to forget, even for an evening, that every toast and every dance step is part of a larger pattern. For Sigismund, marriage isn't just ceremony, it's the architecture of his political world, each vow a brick in the structure he's building across kingdoms. When you finally step out into the cooler night air, the sound of music and laughter follows you, muffled by the heavy doors. Above, the stars shine with the kind of clarity that only comes after a feast, the air scrubbed clean by hours of firelight and wine. You think about how many alliances began under those stars and how many ended before the next feast could be planned. You step into a stone passage that smells faintly of wood smoke and damp wool, the sort of scent that clings to a cloak after a long night outside. Somewhere ahead, faint music drifts down the hall, but it's broken now and then by bursts of laughter that don't sound like they belong in a throne room. You've entered the court of James IV of Scotland, though court might be too formal a word for the places he sometimes prefers. The mainstream fact straightens its doublet. James IV, who reigned from 1488 to 1513, was known not only for his political skill and patronage of learning, but also for wandering Edinburgh in disguise to mingle with his subjects. Sometimes these nocturnal excursions were said to be for gathering intelligence, other times simply for pleasure, or for mischief. Historians still argue whether these wanderings were genuine acts of curiosity or calculated performances to endear himself to the people. A large chamber opens before you, but it isn't the grand hall. It's a staging ground of sorts. Cloaks hang on pegs near the door, some patched, some smelling faintly of ale and horse. On a bench rests a pile of caps and hoods, the kind that could let a man blend into the crowd at a tavern or market. James's own court clothes, rich velvet, gold thread, jewelled fastenings, are nowhere in sight. Instead, a servant is fussing with a plain brown jerkin laid out across a chair, the buttons worn smooth from use. The fringed tidbit arrives via a young page carrying a lantern. He swears the king once returned from one of these nighttime jaunts with a sprig of rosemary tucked into his cap, claiming it had been given to him by the prettiest lass in Leith. Whether that was romance, jest, or a planted story to keep the court guessing, no one seems to know. Light joke number 1. Royal prerogative apparently includes keeping everyone wondering if you're dating anonymous. Through an unmarked door you find a narrow staircase leading down to the kitchens. The smell of meat pies and fresh bread is heavy here, and you catch sight of a pot of spiced ale being ladled into mugs. A man at the table, one of James's companions for the night by the look of him, grins and tells you the king likes to start his disguised evenings with a hearty meal, so as not to waste precious time hunting food when there's talking to be done. You notice he doesn't say drinking or flirting, though the gleam in his eye suggests both are on the itinerary. James himself appears a moment later, already dressed in the brown jerkin, his hair tucked beneath a woolen cap. Without the trappings of the crown, he could almost be mistaken for a prosperous merchant's son, or perhaps an ambitious clerk. He greets each of his companions in turn, his manner warm and direct. It's easy to see how such excursions could win him information the gilded throne never would. Historians still argue whether the reports he brought back to court influenced policy or simply satisfied his restless streak. The quirky tidbit comes from a grey-bearded cook who leans out of the kitchen doorway. Once, after returning from a night in disguise, James ordered the palace bakers to copy a pie he'd eaten in a village inn, a pie stuffed with pigeon, onions, and a surprising amount of pepper. It became a favourite in the palace for a year, until the Queen reportedly declared she was tired of peppery pigeon. Light joke number 2. In modern terms, that's the royal version of "we're not ordering from that place again." Following the group out into the chill night, you find yourself on a narrow street paved with slick cobbles. The lamps here are few, their oil burning low, and the wind from the Firth of Forth cuts through your cloak. The king walks at an easy pace, stopping to talk with passers-by, a fishmonger closing up shop, a pair of sailors arguing about wages, a woman selling roasted chestnuts from a brazier. In each conversation, James listens more than he speaks, but you notice how his questions are sharp, how he nudges for details without drawing suspicion. At a tavern near the edge of the harbour, the party slips inside. The warmth and smell of hops hit you immediately, along with the sour tang of sweat from men who've been at sea too long. The king orders ale for his group, and soon the room fills with the hum of conversation. You watch him blend in, laughing at a bawdy joke, offering to throw dice with a sailor, nodding along to a fiddler's tune. It's an easy performance, but whether it's all theatre or partly instinct is impossible to tell. The fringe tidbit comes again, this time from the fiddler himself, between songs. He says the king once played a prank on the palace guards by returning from an outing through the kitchen door, covered in soot and pretending to be a chimney sweep. Supposedly the guards let him pass without a second glance. Historians still argue whether this really happened or if it's the sort of tavern tale that grows better with every retelling. As the night wears on, you see the king lean across the table to speak quietly with a burly man whose hands are scarred from rope burns. The conversation is too low for you to catch, but the man leaves with a respectful nod, perhaps news of shipping routes, or a dispute in the docks. Whatever it is, it's gathered here, far from the echo of official chambers. When the group finally leaves the tavern, the straths are quieter, the air sharper, the lamps gutter in the wind and the stones shine wet underfoot. James walks with his companions back toward the palace, pausing once to toss a coin to a beggar huddled in a doorway. The man thanks him without realizing who he's speaking to. Back in the warm chamber where the cloaks and caps hang, the king strips off the jerkin, handing it to a servant. Within minutes he's back in finer clothes, though not yet the full regalia. There's something in his eyes, a spark of satisfaction, as though he's brought back more than just stories. You wonder how many such nights he's had, and how many decisions in his reign have been shaped by things learned under an assumed name. Light joke number 3, it's the medieval kingly version of making a burner account to see what people are really saying. You stroll into a courtyard washed in moonlight, the air heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint tang of wine spilled on stone. Beyond a row of clipped hedges, music swirls, flutes and lutes weaving a pattern that's neither courtly nor entirely innocent. You've arrived in the lush, perfumed heart of Francis I France, a Renaissance court where pleasure and politics move hand in hand, each daring the other to go one step further. The mainstream fact greets you in satin and gold. Francis I, King of France from 1515 to 1547, was a towering figure of the French Renaissance, famed for his patronage of artists like Leonardo da Vinci, his lavish court festivals, and his cultivation of an image as both warrior and poet. But alongside his cultural triumphs ran a constant undercurrent of scandal, whispers of romantic entanglements, extravagant entertainments, and indulgences that blurred the line between art and appetite. Historians still argue whether his court of pleasures was a deliberate instrument of soft power or simply an indulgence he couldn't resist. You step beneath an arched trellis into the royal gardens, lit by hundreds of lanterns suspended from branches. The glow turns the pathways into rivers of gold. Courtiers drift between hedges, their laughter muffled by the rustle of silk. Ahead, a pavilion spills light and music, its open sides revealing dancers moving with the kind of practiced ease that hides endless rehearsal. The fringe tidbit arrives with a tray of candied orange peels carried by a page. He murmurs that the king once staged a masque in which the entire court dressed as Greek gods and goddesses, with Francis himself as Jupiter. The costumes were so elaborate and the roles so flirtatiously played that the evening is still talked about as much for its whispered side stories as for the artistry. Light joke number 1, somewhere a probably woke up that night with a mysterious urge to preach about hubris. Inside the pavilion, the air smells of rosewater and warm beeswax from candles set in elaborate silver stands. Francis stands near the centre, taller than most around him, dressed in a doublet of deep crimson velvet embroidered with gold thread. His beard is neatly trimmed, his smile quick and inclusive. He greets a visiting noblewoman with a bow that's almost too low, murmuring something that makes her laugh behind her fan. A court musician in the corner plucks at a lute, his song drifting over the murmur of conversation. You catch a fragment of words, love, loyalty, longing that could as easily be addressed to the king as from him. It's here that you begin to sense the deliberate construction of Francis's image. Warrior king in the field, cultured lover in the salon, each role played to an audience primed to adore him. Historians still argue whether this careful balance strengthened his political hand or left him vulnerable to enemies who saw it as vanity. The quirky tidbit finds you near a table laden with miniature sculptures in sugar, castles, ships, even a tiny scene of a hunt, all painstakingly crafted for the feast. A chef in a tall cap whispers that Francis sometimes had sugar sculptures made to resemble members of his court, complete with subtle caricatures. It was a dangerous honour. You could be immortalised as a gallant knight, or as a fox raiding the chicken coop. Light joke number 2, the medieval edible equivalent of tagging someone in an unflattering photo. Beyond the pavilion, the gardens open to a small lake where swan-shaped boats drift under the glow of floating lanterns. A couple slips into one, their heads bent close together as they push away from shore. You watch them glide into the shadows, the boat's prow cutting a V through the reflected stars. Somewhere out there, you imagine, a deal might be struck, a secret shared, always under the cover of entertainment. Francis moves through the crowd like a practiced host, pausing to speak with artists, poets, ambassadors, and ladies-in-waiting. Each conversation is punctuated with a gesture toward the dancers or the musicians, as though to remind everyone that they are part of something grander than a simple party. You notice how he listens, intently, leaning in just enough to make the speaker feel singled out, then moves on before the spell can break. The fringe tidbit brushes past you again when a young poet, clutching a small bound book, whispers that the king once commissioned verses from 3 different writers on the same subject, a lady's beauty, then secretly judged them as though it were a tournament. The winner received a gold chain, the losers a polite smile and a place in the next masque. Historians still argue whether these contests were meant to foster art or simply to keep the court constantly vying for his attention. As the night deepens, the music shifts to a slower tempo. Dancers pair off under the lanterns, their steps graceful, their expressions carefully schooled to hide, or half-hide, the thrill of being seen. Francis himself takes the hand of a lady in a gown of midnight blue, leading her into the dance. Around them, the courtiers form a loose circle, watching the easy authority in his movements. You get the sense that this is the heart of his power, not just on the battlefield or in council, but here, in these moments when the court feels like an extension of his own charm. The quirky tidbit resurfaces one last time for the evening when you pass a servant carrying a golden cup shaped like a seashell. He tells you the king sometimes insisted on drinking certain wines only from cups modelled after natural forms, shells, horns, even leaves, claiming it made the flavour more alive. Light joke number 3, the 16th century version of "It just tastes better in a mason jar." You leave the gardens reluctantly, the music fading behind you, the scent of rosewater still clinging to your clothes. Ahead, the palace looms dark against the night sky, but you carry with you the glow of the court's theatre, a place where every glance, every dance step, and every sip of wine is part of a grand performance, scripted by a king who knows his audience. The corridor you walk now is heavier somehow, its air thicker with expectation. Rich hangings of crimson and gold swallow the torchlight, and your boots sink slightly into rugs woven so densely you can barely hear your own footsteps. At the far end, through a pair of tall doors inlaid with Tudor roses, lies a chamber steeped in the scent of beeswax polish, roses from the palace gardens, and a faint whiff of ink. This is the England of Henry VIII, a king whose appetite for change in both politics and marriage remade the kingdom and left a trail of whispers thick as the tapestries on his walls. The mainstream fact plants itself squarely in the middle of the room. Henry VIII, reigning from 1509 to 1547, is infamous for his 6 marriages, his break with Rome, and his seismic reshaping of England's religion and monarchy. His queens, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, are as much a part of his legend as the king himself. Historians still argue whether his marital decisions were driven primarily by dynastic necessity, personal desire, political calculation, or the volatile blend of all three. The hall beyond opens into a private dining chamber. At the head of the table, a great chair stands empty, a carved H entwined with an R above it. Henry and whichever queen holds the title at that moment. The table gleams with silver trenchers, goblets, and a tall salt cellar shaped like a castle. It's a feast in miniature. A dozen sugared marchpane sculptures of swans, peacocks, and Tudor roses, all ready to be eaten when the mood turns playful enough. The fringe tidbit sidles up in the form of a courtier leaning near the hearth. He murmurs that the king sometimes had music played softly during private suppers, not for romance but so no one could overhear his words to the queen. "Walls have ears," the man says, "and i.e. in this court, so do the servants." Whether this is fact or just the kind of cautionary tale that sticks in the corridors, you can't quite tell. Light joke number 1. Apparently even the walls in Tudor England were nosy. On a table near the window lies a velvet-lined chest, its contents partly revealed. Delicate gloves scented with ambergris, a chain of gold links heavy enough to serve as a weapon, and a small, leather-bound book with pages covered in the king's bold hand. He was known to compose and play music himself, and you half wonder if this is an original song or a draft of a love letter destined for one queen or another. You follow a side passage to the royal chapel where sunlight falls through stained glass in jewel-like pools. Here the connection between marriage and politics is most visible, the place where vows are made or annulled, where the crown's relationship with the church is displayed like a public marriage of its own. The air smells faintly of incense, though it's tinged with the memory of tension. This is where Henry's decision to break from Rome still echoes in the stone. Historians still argue whether this break was inevitable or sparked solely by his determination to wed Anne Boleyn. The quirky tidbit comes from a musician loitering in the gallery. He swears the king once commanded an entire evening of love songs in French, only to switch to hunting ballads halfway through when Anne Boleyn teased him about his accent. Whether true or embellished, it's an image that makes you grin. A monarch half-charmed, half-challenged. Light joke number 2, even kings can't always win the banter. Back in the private chambers, you see portraits of each queen lining one wall, their gazes fixed, each framed in heavy gilding. The room smells faintly of lavender and parchment. Henry's relationships weren't just personal affairs. They were national events, each marriage altering alliances, religious tides, and courtly fortunes. You can almost hear the murmurs behind the scenes. Who will rise with the next queen, and who will fall? In the corner stands a tall cabinet with intricate marquetry, its doors slightly ajar. Inside are gifts, rings, jewelled brooches, miniatures in gold lockets, tokens given to or by the queens. One, a locket shaped like a heart that opens to reveal 2 tiny portraits, catches your eye. The paint is delicate, the face is vivid even after years, and you wonder if it was worn in secret or proudly displayed. The fringe tidbit wanders back in the voice of an elderly lady-in-waiting who claims that Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth queen, once slipped a note into the king's hunting satchel, scented so strongly with rose oil that he was teased about it for days. Whether it was affection or calculated charm, no one can quite agree. Historians still argue whether Catherine was a naive girl or a shrewd player who simply misjudged the stakes. Later, you find yourself standing in the king's presence chamber, the place where he received petitioners. Here, the floors are scrubbed to a shine, the tapestries dense with scenes of hunting, feasting, and triumph. Even in the formal space, there's a subtle emphasis on intimacy. The dais for the throne is shallow, the chair positioned so that Henry can lean forward, closing the space between himself and those he speaks to. You imagine him using the same skill in private conversation with a queen, drawing her in just enough before delivering a decision. The quirky tidbit emerges one last time when a herald tells you the king sometimes had his jesters deliver messages between him and his wives so that any tense exchange could be softened with humour. Light joke number 3. It's the 16th century version of using a meme to apologise. By the time you leave the chamber, the scent of ambergris still lingers faintly in your nose, along with the faint echo of music somewhere deeper in the palace. The legacy of Henry's reign feels as tangible as the gold thread in the tapestries, woven from power, desire, calculation, and the dangerous business of marriage. In this court, every vow was a turning point, and every whisper a possible prophecy. The sound of a bow dragging lightly over strings reaches you first, slow, graceful notes spilling into the hallway like warm candlelight. You follow it through a side door and into a long gallery strung with lanterns, each swaying faintly in a draught that smells of wine, perfume, and beeswax polish. This is the Denmark of Christian IV, where the night sometimes dresses itself in a mask and politics hides behind painted smiles. The mainstream fact greets you with a flourish of silk. Christian IV, who reigned from 1588 to 1648, is remembered as one of Denmark's most energetic and flamboyant monarchs. He poured resources into naval power, architecture, and trade, but also into entertainment, lavish banquets, festivals, and most famously, elaborate masquerade balls where courtiers mixed freely behind concealing masks. Historians still argue whether these masked nights were clever tools for diplomacy and intrigue, or merely an expensive indulgence during an era that also saw costly wars and debt. At the far end of the gallery, a great hall opens, lit by hundreds of candles that throw a golden haze over everything. The music swells, and you see a swirl of masked figures gliding across the polished floor. Their silks whisper as they pass, a low susurration beneath the strings and flutes. The masks are works of art, some shaped like animals, some gilded, others painted in bright colours. The fringe tidbit finds you via a page carrying a tray of goblets. He leans close and confides that the king himself often wore a plain black mask at these events, blending in so he could listen without being recognised. Supposedly, this was how he discovered more than one brewing scandal in his court. Whether true or not, you can picture him watching from the edges of the dance, eyes sharp behind the anonymity. Light joke number 1, the original lurking in the group chat under a fake usurner. And a long banquet table runs along one side of the hall, piled with delicacies from across the Danish trade network, smoked salmon, spiced herring, candied almonds, and sweet wines from the Rhineland. The air is warm with the scent of cinnamon and roasting meats. You notice how people drift to the table in pairs or small groups, often pausing to speak in low tones before melting back into the masked crowd. It's a feast, yes, but also a moving map of alliances and flirtations. Off to one side, Christian himself appears, tall and broad, dressed in a doublet embroidered with silver thread that catches the candlelight. His mask tonight is simple, but edged with tiny pearls. He moves easily between groups, clasping hands, exchanging a joke here, a compliment there. Even under the disguise, his voice carries the authority of someone used to command, but also the warmth of a host who understands the art of making everyone feel included. The quirky tidbit drifts over from a musician tuning a lute in the corner. He claims the king once threw a masquerade where everyone had to come dressed as a character from ancient history, and that Christian, assigned Julius Caesar, insisted on being carried into the hall in a mock triumph. The Romans threw roses, the Gauls booed theatrically, and the evening ended with a staged assassination that had guests roaring with laughter. Historians still argue whether this was clever satire or simply good fun with an imperial price tag. Light joke number 2, the after-party must have been the Ides of March buffet. You weave through the crowd and catch snippets of conversation, some in Danish, others in German, Dutch or French. Merchants, diplomats and nobles mingle here without the rigid seating charts of a formal council, and you can see why the king favoured these nights. Deals can be floated without public scrutiny, rivalries softened with a shared laugh behind a mask. Of course, not every exchange is friendly. The tilt of a chin or the arch of an eyebrow can cut sharper than any blade. The fringe tidbit returns when a masked woman in a gown of green silk tells you that on some nights the king would step away from the dance entirely and slip into the kitchen, sampling dishes and chatting with the cooks. Sometimes, she says, he'd bring a tray back into the hall himself, offering it as though he were a servant just to see if anyone noticed. Historians still argue if this was mischief or a deliberate way to remind courtiers that the mask could hide a king just as easily as a commoner. As the music swells into a faster tune, the floor fills again, couples twirling, skirts flaring, boots striking the wood in perfect time. Christian joins in, his broad frame surprisingly nimble, spinning his partner with a laugh that's clearly audible over the music. Watching him, you realize how much these nights are about performance, not just the dancing and costumes, but the unspoken theatre of power, charm, and control. The quirky tidbit slips in one more time from a wine steward who whispers that the king had a favourite game, trying to guess people's identities mid-dance, using only their steps and their voice. He was rarely wrong, the steward insists, and if he did guess incorrectly, he would double the gift he sent them the next morning. Light joke number 3, the world's fanciest version of Guess Who with diplomatic stakes. The night winds on, and the air grows warmer, the candles shorter. The masks begin to tilt, a few are removed entirely, and conversations lose some of their careful phrasing. The king, though still moving from group to group, begins to slow his pace, laughing more, gesturing broadly. The mood has shifted from courtly elegance to something looser, and you can see that this too is part of the design, allowing barriers to fall just enough that real feelings, real opinions, slip free. When you finally step back into the cooler hallway, the echo of music follows you, mingling with the faint perfume of the hall. Behind you, the masquerade continues, the swirl of silk and candlelight hiding truths and half-truths in plain sight. And you can't help but think that for Christian IV, the mask was never just an ornament. It was a mirror, showing people not only what they wanted to be seen as, but what the king wanted to see. The moment you step through the doors, you're swallowed by the glow of mirrors, tall panels framed in gilt, their glass shimmering with 100 reflections of candle flames. The air here is warm with beeswax, powdered perfume, and the faintest musk of worn velvet. You're at Versailles, though not in the dazzling prime of Louis XIV's reign. This is the 18th century under Louis XV, a king whose shadow stretches as far as the glass in these mirrored halls. The mainstream fact drapes itself in silk. Louis XV, who ruled France from 1715 to 1774, inherited a kingdom at the height of its opulence, but also on the brink of deep political and financial trouble. His early promise as Louis the Well-Beloved faded under the weight of scandals, particularly surrounding his private life, most notoriously his relationships with mistresses like Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry. Historians still argue whether the lavishness of his personal court was a deliberate continuation of Bourbon spectacle or a costly distraction hastening the monarchy's decline. The Hall of Mirrors tonight is quieter than its reputation suggests. A string quartet plays softly near the far end, their music spilling into the high-arched ceiling. Courtiers drift in clusters, their satin coats and embroidered gowns rustling faintly against the parquet floor. Conversation here is practiced, light, witty, and yet carefully restrained. The fringe tidbit finds you via a footman carrying a tray of petits fours. He murmurs that the king sometimes used this very hall for private midnight gatherings long after the day's ceremonies were over. The mirrors, he claimed, made the company seem larger, the hours seem shorter. Whether it's truth or romantic invention, you can picture it. The flicker of a few dozen candles becoming hundreds in the glass, the intimacy multiplied. Light joke number 1, it's basically tea. He 18th century version of turning on mirrored display in a video call to make your party look bigger. From here, you pass through a side door into the king's private apartment. The shift is immediate. Rooms are smaller, warmer, the light softer. The scent of rosewater and tobacco mingles with something sweeter, perhaps vanilla, rare enough to be a luxury in itself. On a polished table rests a porcelain cup of steaming chocolate, the froth still clinging to its rim. Louis was known to favour such indulgences, often served in cups painted with pastoral scenes that made the drink seem even more decadent. The quirky tidbit drifts over from a valet adjusting the folds of a curtain. He swears the king occasionally disguised himself as a common nobleman to visit Paris's more discreet salons, where he would listen to the talk of merchants, artists and writers. Supposedly he brought back stories from these outings to amuse Madame de Pompadour. Historians still argue whether these forays were genuine curiosity or carefully staged acts to gauge the public mood. A small writing desk near the window holds neat stacks of parchment. The ink is fresh on one, a letter to a provincial governor written in the king's own hand. The penmanship is elegant, but the tone, while formal, has a touch of warmth that suggests a ruler who liked to speak directly, at least in private correspondence. Through another door, you enter a salon where a portrait of Madame de Pompadour dominates the wall. She is depicted as both refined and confident, the brushwork soft yet exacting. Around her image hangs the unspoken truth. She was more than a mistress, an advisor, a patron of the arts, a force in shaping court culture. The same could be said, in a different way, for Madame du Barry later in his reign, though her arrival sparked scandal. You feel the tension between affection and politics woven into these walls. The fringe tidbit finds you again when a lady-in-waiting passes, whispering that Pompadour once arranged a surprise theatrical performance in the king's private chambers, complete with costumes she had designed herself. The story goes that Louis laughed so hard he had to stop the play midway for fear of spilling his wine. Whether exaggerated or not, it fits the picture of a court that blurred the lines between amusement and statecraft. The quirky tidbit lands when a court musician tells you that the king had a habit of tapping his fingers in time to music during council meetings, an unconscious beat that sometimes revealed his mood more clearly than his words. Light joke number 2. Imagine trying to negotiate taxes while the king's drumming out the rhythm of a minuet. In a corner of the salon, you spot a small gilded cage with a canary inside. The bird hops along its perch, chirping softly. You're told the king enjoyed the sound, and sometimes kept such birds near him during private audiences, the song serving as a kind of gentle background to conversation. It's a detail that feels oddly human, a glimpse into the quieter pleasures of a man remembered for grandeur and scandal alike. As the evening wanes, you follow the sound of the quartet back toward the Hall of Mirrors. The light has shifted, candles burned lower, shadows growing longer. The mirrors still shimmer, but now they seem to reflect not just the room, but the weight of years, the cost of splendor maintained past its prime. The fringe tidbit makes one final appearance as a young page remarks that on certain nights Louis would have all the mirrors covered with drapes, saying he preferred the company of the room alone. Whether that was superstition, melancholy, or just a passing whim, no one could say. Historians still argue whether his later years were marked more by isolation or by a calculated withdrawal from public life. You step into the cooler corridor beyond, the sound of music fading behind the thick doors. The scent of roses lingers on your clothes, along with the faint echo of whispered laughter. Here, in the shadow of Versailles, the court is still a stage, the masks more refined but no less present, and the king, well-beloved or not, remains the central figure in a play whose ending is already written in history. Light joke number 3. If these mirrors could talk, the gossip columns would never run out of copy. You step into a courtyard so bright with morning that the stone looks sugared, and then you stop short. There's a leopard on a chain 5 strides ahead of you, tail lashing like a metronome set to "Do Not Run." The handler gives you a dismissive nod as if a spotted predator is a decor choice, like a fountain or a potted rosemary. The creature's breath blooms white in the cool air, and when it yawns, the pink cave of its mouth reveals teeth designed to turn diplomatic missteps into headlines. You edge sideways, thanking every saint on the calendar for soft shoes and slower movements. Exotic gifts. Dangerous pets. This is where rulers advertise daring the way others advertise embroidery. The mainstream fact pads in with soft paws. English kings kept a royal menagerie at the Tower of London from the 13th century onward. Lions, leopards, even a polar bear given to Henry III, which, so the record says, was sometimes led to the Thames to fish on a chain. Meanwhile, an elephant reached London as well, a gift from the French king. Its hulking curiosity must have turned every alley into a parade route. You picture the handlers whispering to each other the way courtiers do. Do we have enough hay? Also, what is hay? Across the yard, a falconer passes and you get a whiff of leather and meat. The bird on his glove blinks with the imperious calm of a creature that believes the sky is personal property. Remember those little hoods you saw hanging neatly in Philip the Fair's chamber? Here the hood is off, and the hawk's eyes cut the courtyard into sharp angles. A memory clicks into place. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen scribbling notes for De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, the great treatise on falconry, science filtered through feathers, the emperor's intellect braided with talons. Historians still argue whether Frederick prized falconry mainly as noble sport or as a true laboratory for observing nature, but either way, the birds were both status and study, a double-edged feather. A servant hurries past with a small lidded basket, and the handler of the leopard waves him through with the practiced calm of a man who has seen worse. Inside the basket is a monkey, no, 2, chittering in a way that suggests they have opinions about breakfast. The fringe tidbit arrives with a grin from a groom. He claims a certain queen kept a marmoset trained to tug at the sleeves of courtiers who overstayed their welcome, a furry hourglass that ended conversations with adorable tyranny. True or not, you can hear the muffled apology. My lady, the monkey insists. Light joke number 1. Somewhere a modern receptionist sighs, must be nice to outsource time boxing to a primate. You drift along the arcade where the shade is blue and the smell of straw mingles with hints of spice. A pair of courtiers debate whether the leopard is technically a panther because poets prefer the word. You suspect the cat does not care. At the far end, a low door opens onto a narrow stable where an ostrich blinks at you with prehistoric disdain. A stable boy holds up a twisted nail. "It swallowed this," he says, half proud, half worried. In courts where rumour is currency, the bird's talent for digesting iron becomes an instant metaphor. A treasurer hearing it will mutter that taxes could be collected more efficiently if citizens had ostrich stomachs. You, hearing it, step politely out of pecking distance. On a plinth sits a carved basin ringed with bright stones. A courtier in embroidered sleeves explains too casually that it's a gift from a distant emir. Onyx, agate, lapis, names that roll like marbles. Gifts like these arrive with the same intent as a troop of cavalry. They move borders just with silk. You recall Alfonso the Magnanimous and his lavender-scented Livy. Knowledge travelled by page, but so did power by parcel. A giraffe once tread Florentine streets in Lorenzo's time, all eyelashes and improbable angles. You imagine masons leaning out of scaffolds to see it glide, the city briefly turning into a bestiary illustration. Was it love of the marvellous, or a calculation that astonishment itself is policy? Historians still argue whether these displays softened foreign negotiations or merely fed courtly appetite for novelty, leaving the ledger to groan later. Someone laughs behind you and the sound snaps like a banner in wind. You turn to see a lesser noble presenting a glove to the master of the menagerie. It's stitched with tiny strawberries among oak leaves. Remember those coy berries woven into tapestries at Louis's court? Except here the joke is bolder. Strawberries for sweetness, oak for strength, leather for control. The language of gifts is as deliberate as any ordinance. The master strokes the glove, judging thickness. He nods toward a cage where a lynx watches with pale green patience. "Try not to smell like rabbit," he says, and it isn't entirely a joke. Near an arch the air changes. You smell warm bread and something musky. A handler leads in a young lion with a mane like a sunrise, just beginning to lift. Its gold eyes snag yours and hold. The chain groans softly when the lion tests the distance, the lynx speaking fluent honesty about who controls whom. The court's chatter falters, then resumes with careful brightness, the way conversation resumed, after a plate shatters in a crowded room. You measure how far you are from the nearest door and decide that discretion is the better part of valor and also the better part of keeping your arms. Light joke number 2. A quick mental note that your personal brand prefers cats that weigh less than a destrier. A captain strides by, explaining in the tone of a man auditioning for posterity that leopards symbolize conquest of the exotic, lions the keeping of justice, elephants the weight of wisdom. Symbols are handy like that. They carry the load so people don't have to. Still, the reality sweats through. Animals eat, pace, sicken, escape. An elephant can turn a triumphal entry into a logistical crisis. A polar bear can tug itself into the river because fish smell like destiny. Courts manage this with layered confidence, plausible and perfume, as if confidence could cork a tusk. The quirky tidbit sidles into your ear courtesy of a veterinary barber, yes, both, who insists that a certain foreign delegation once sent crocodile eggs as a curiosity, and the kitchen tried to hatch one by keeping them near the bread ovens. "We were hoping for a small one," he admits, eyes shifting, "for the fountain." You almost ask whether they'd prepared sunscreen of the ancient kind. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen you joked about earlier, but decide some punchlines are best left to imagination. Light joke number 3. In any case, SPF stands for Seriously Please Flee. You pause beside a carved stone trough where water trembles with each footfall of something large in an unseen stall. The tremble feels like a rumour you can drink. Around you, the market of marvels continues. A tray of parrots loud enough to be drafted into espionage. a crate of spices whose scent seems to argue for amnesty from all sins, a velvet cushion bearing a snake so languid you suspect it of theatre, a clerk, ink-stained, tidy, takes notes on each gift, recording origin, cost, temperament, who gasped, who pretended not to, who has already whispered a request for the creature to appear at a masque. He writes faster when nobles hover, slower when they don't, an economy of pen strokes that says more about rank than any oration. You step back into sun and find the leopard again, closer now, chain held short. Its whiskers twitch at a fly, and somehow the small motion makes the world sharpen. You think of the tower's polar bear, of Frederick's falcons, of painted giraffes that walked out of story into street, of the way Francis turned a court into theatre and Christian turned a masque into a method. Power loves a spectacle because spectacle reroutes attention. But animals are stubborn co-authors. They refuse to say lines on cue, and that refusal can be the most honest moment of the day. The handler tugs, the cat yields with the offended grace of a prince asked to share. As they pass, you catch the faintest scent, musk, straw, a ghost of cinnamon from some earlier feast. Your heart eases back into its cage. Above the arcade, banners flick and settle. Somewhere a hawk whistles keen and metal bright, and the courtyard glances up as one body. When the leopard disappears through a gate, the fear and wonder it brought do not vanish. They settle into the stone like heat. This is how courts memorize themselves. A menagerie is a footnote that thinks it's a headline, and sumptus. Imes it is. You step forward again, slower but surer, and feel the whole palace tilt a fraction back toward normal, if that word has meaning where lions nap and ostriches eat hardware. Ahead, the shadowed passage opens toward another cluster of voices, another set of mirrors, another place for strawberries to hide in leaves while the chain-link music fades into memory. You slip from the palace menagerie into streets that smell of tar, yeast and possibility, and before long the walls fall away to a harbour where masts knit the sky into a loom of lines. Here the wind is a courier, ferrying one country's secrets to another, and the cobbles remember every hurried foot that ran to tell, "You'll never guess what the king of..." The voices around you, salted with accents like pepper on stew, belong to people who treat news as a second cargo, merchants, sailors, factors, packmen with dust-laced boots. If court was theatre, this is the market of imagination, where tickets are paid in rumour and the performance never ends. Inside a dockside tavern, the ale smell hugs you like an old cloak. On a scarred table, a roll of waxed cloth lies beside a tally stick, a bronze scale and, most importantly, a mouth already halfway through a story. He keeps a fountain that runs wine, the speaker insists, palm thudding the wood for emphasis. You nearly laugh, remembering the piper's tale of Vladislav the Drunkard's liquid architecture. Across from him, a Hanseatic trader with beard like a bramble patch snorts. A fountain? Bah! In my port, the leopard naps by the bakehouse. You resist the impulse to raise a hand and say, "Seen it." Instead, you sip and listen as two ports duel with details the way knights duel with lances. The mainstream fact pulls up a stool. For 2 shining centuries, the champagne fairs stitched Europe together. Troyes, Provins, Lagny, Bar. Caravans wheeling in from Flanders, Italy, the Rhineland and beyond. Cloth met spice, coin met credit, oath met handshake. The fairs were not just markets for goods, they were depots for information where a Milanese packet could arrive with peppercorns and leave with a scandal salted to taste. You can feel the echo of that system here in the harbour's rhythm. When ships are calendars, gossip keeps time. H. Historians still argue whether these trade arteries spread truth faster than rumour, or whether rumour was the very grease that kept the wagons rolling. A boy threads the tables selling little ginger cakes moulded like crowns, one of this port's festive quirks. A baker calls after him, "Get your sweet treason," a joke that lands in a room where everyone knows a confection can carry a barb. You buy one and notice strawberries pressed into the glaze, tiny red dots that wink at you like those cheeky fruits hiding in tapestries. Apparently even pastry is in on the code of temptation. Light joke number 1. You consider asking if there's a flavor called Constitutional Crisis with extra icing. At the next table, a Venetian factor lays out packets of letters sealed with different colors. He calls them avvisi, news sheets, whispers caught and written before they float away. He speaks of a French king whose mirrors multiply guests at midnight. The Bohemian grocer, hearing this, decides the mirrors were installed by monks. By the time the tale reaches the next town, the monks are alchemists and the mirrors are portals. The factor shrugs. A ship leaves Venice. By Ragusa the cargo has shifted. You nod, thinking of that crocodile dung sunscreen you joked about. How one odd scrap, once launched, breeds a shoal of replicas. The door bangs, bringing in a gust of fish and a man with a sea-scarred jaw who claims he saw Eric of Pomerania chase a pirate into a fog so thick the waves forgot how to be waves. You heard a version in Eric's own hall. Here it wears a saltier coat. A woman from Bruges counters with a tidbit about a Scottish king drinking with dockmen in a cap still dusted with flour. James IV, of course, except now the flour is soot and the dockmen are smugglers, and the king pays the ale with a coin minted that very morning from his smile. The room laughs because detail is the coin of plausibility. You step back into the street and follow a caravan of pack horses toward the counting houses where information is sorted like wool by grade. Inside one, the smell shifts to parchment, lamp oil, and wet leather. A clerk copies numbers with a careful hand while 2 merchants trade intelligence more precious than pepper. Which duke is holding a wedding? Which queen prefers lemon? Which city has its gates down for plague? You hear Charles the Bad's fiery death told as certainty by a man who sells lamp wicks. Bad business to sell flame and doubt. You want to say, maybe, but markets prefer prices to probabilities. Light joke number 2. If the truth wore a hat in here, it would be the one with a discreet price tag. Further on, the Fonda Co., half warehouse, half embassy, gathers traders like a hive does bees. A Genoese sits with a Catalan, agreeing that Alfonso the Magnanimous reads in bed but disagreeing on what, Livy to one, lovesick poetry to the other. Both insist they heard it from a cousin who saw. Memory, you notice, is a cousin whose house you never visit. The Catalan produces a whalebone whistle, curved and smooth, saying sailors use its pitch to mark categories of gossip at sea. 2 notes for seen, 3 for heard, 1 sad flat for invented but too good to waste. Is it true? Maybe not. But now you can't unhear the tiny music across a night deck, a ledger kept in tones. On a quay studded with barrels, a pilgrim kneels to tighten a strap and shares a tattered tale. A Templar curse hissed into the Seine, a line of kings snapping like dry twigs. You remember standing in Philip the Fair's chill rooms while a canary sang against silence, and you file the curse beside the mirrors, too neat, too narratively satisfying, but so portable a story that pack horses carry it without complaint. Historians still argue whether curses are born from superstition or from the human urge to bind scattered events with a single ribbon. The ribbon here is crimson. It stains fingers pleasantly. A scribe sells copies of a letter alleging that a northern queen sends invisible ink notes, lemon juice again, while a sailor swears an ostrich in a king's yard eats nails and contracts. A cloth merchant offers a side dish of court signals, ribbons knotted left for safe, right for meat, double for danger. You heard the same code in a French gallery. Now it arrives second-hand with a flourish and a bolt of ribbon for sale. Commerce and rumour turn out to be excellent dance partners. At a stall stacked with blue-dyed cloth, a woman with hennaed hands tells you she once saw a giraffe in Florence, stepping past fresco painters who painted faster just to keep up. "It's eyelashes," she says, pinching the air, "like brushes." The man beside her tops that with a polar bear in a chain fishing the Thames. You've walked those images already in stone and story. Here they live as coins change hands, as if marvel itself were inventory. Light joke number 3. You half expect someone to offer a discount if you take a lion with your lapis. Evening comes with a copper glow, and the harbour's gossip softens to a murmur. A friar preaches against slander near the fishmongers. 5 paces away, a spice dealer murmurs a fresher slander with cardamom breath. The contradictions don't cancel, they harmonise. You realise that across borders, kings are less men than canvases. Each port paints them with local colours. Wine where wine is wealth, fur where fur is coin, mirrors where glass is pride. So King John becomes a professional philanderer in one town and a collector of mirrors in another. Ethelbald is either a bold consolidator or a walking scandal. Francis I is Jupiter, or just a man who liked ornate cups. You think back to the symbols you've been reading all night. The strawberries coy in leaves, the silver hand mirror, the ribbon knots, the falcon hoods, and see how easily they travel. A berry in a border becomes fruit in a pie, becomes a proverb about sweetness that stains. A mirror gifted to a favourite becomes a rumour about thousands of mirrors. A hood for a hawk becomes a mask for a king. The road edits as ruthlessly as any court. At last, you stop at the end of the pier, where the sea licks the stones and the ships breathe like sleeping animals. Somewhere far inland, a clerk will write tonight's embellishment as fact, because the phrasing pleases him and the ledger wants filling. Somewhere on another coast, a minstrel will sand the corners off a truth because a rounded edge catches more ears, and you, still second person, still moving, stand in the drift of it and accept that what crosses borders best is not wheat or wool, but emotion disguised as information. You turn back toward the city lights, pockets full of borrowed stories, feeling them shift like coins. None will buy you the whole truth, but together they pay for something close, a map of how humans turn power into narrative, and narrative back into power, stamped with lions, leopards, and the occasional ostrich nail. Tomorrow in another port the currency will be exchanged again, shaved a little thinner, shining a little brighter, spendable if you don't look too hard at the mint. The street narrows into a low vaulted passage, the sound of the harbour fading into the hush of old stone. You emerge into a courtyard framed by leaning arcades, the air still and faintly scented with rain-soaked mortar. The bustle of trade and taverns is behind you now. Ahead is a quieter stage, the twilight of the Scandalous throne. No more roaring banquets, no more leopard chains jingling in the sun, no more midnight masks humming under painted ceilings. This is where the grandeur of courts softens at the edges, where time begins to fold the stories back into silence. The mainstream fact sets its seal here. By the late medieval period and into the early modern age, many of the most notorious courts had waned, their kings gone to dust, their reputations surviving only in the writings of chroniclers, poets, and, of course, gossips. Castles were inherited or abandoned, alliances that once turned on a dance step or a ribbon knot shifted into new hands. Historians still argue whether the fading of these decadent courts came from political reform, economic necessity, or simply the exhaustion of extravagance. You step under a gallery where the carved beams are softened with age, the painted heraldry fading like bruises in the wood. The few courtiers left here move slowly, their robes plain by the standards you've seen. They nod politely, voices low, as though noise itself would disturb the dignity of what remains. The thrill of scandal is still here, but now it's like perfume on an old sleeve, faint, lingering, impossible to wash out completely. The fringe tidbit appears in the form of a bent old steward leaning on a cane. He tells you in a voice rasped thin by years that he once carried a sealed letter from a king to a lady in another realm. The court assumed it was a love letter, and the whispers it spawned were enough to tip a treaty. I never knew what was written, he says, but the rumours did more work than the words could have. He smiles at the memory, the kind of smile that knows the taste of secrets. Light joke number 1. You consider telling him he should have charged for rumour delivery by the hour. Past the steward, you find an antechamber lined with portraits. Their frames are dusty, their faces dim, but you recognise them. John, with his restless eyes, Ethelbald with his scandalous bride, Louis the quarrelsome frozen in suspicion, Charles the bad mid-scheme, Philip the fair stern as a polished coin, Alfonso with the faintest smile for Leonor, Vladislav's flushed cheer, Wenceslaus's locked-door languor, Eric's salt-scoured gaze, Alfonso the magnanimous leaning toward a book, Sigismund caught mid-toast, James the Fourth tilting his cap just so, Francis poised in a swirl of silk, Henry with his ring-laden hands, Christian under a carnival mask, Louis XV at ease among mirrors. Around them float the animals, the sugar sculptures, the ribbons, the hawks, props in the theatre of their reigns. The quirky tidbit steps out of a corner. A maid dusting the frames tells you she sometimes talks to the portraits when the room is empty. They answer, she insists, not with words, but with looks. She points to Francis, claiming he smirks more when there's music nearby, and to Henry, whose eyes narrow when she polishes his frame too long. Historians still argue whether such superstitions are just the mind's way of animating the past, or whether some part of a court really does cling to its likenesses. Light joke number 2. You promise yourself never to dust a royal portrait after sunset, just in case. Through a side door, you enter what was once the great hall. The dais is bare now, the throne long removed, its impression in the floor faint but still there, like the ghost of a footprint. The windows are unshuttered and the evening light slides in unimpeded, gilding the motes that dance in the air. You stand where kings and queens once sat, where ministers bent over scrolls, where dancers turned in circles while music filled the rafters. The silence now is almost a kindness. It lets the echoes rest. The fringe tidbit returns one last time as a young archivist enters with an armful of parchment. He says that every so often someone requests a record of some long-past scandal, an affair, a midnight escape, an animal gifted to impress a foreign dignitary. Most of the time, he says, we find the evidence thin, the details contradictory, but that's not why they ask. They want the story. He places the parchments on a table, their edges curling like old leaves. Light joke number 3. You think, of course they do. Half of history is just yesterday's rumour with better penmanship. You linger until the light fades to that soft blue hour when stone seems to breathe. The air cools, and the last slants of sun turn the gallery's far wall to gold. You realise the journey. Through these courts, through scandal and splendour, wit and waste, has been less about judging their kings than about watching the machinery of power dressed in human desire. The trappings may change, crowns to wigs, torches to chandeliers, but the pulse beneath is the same, the hunger to be seen, to be remembered, even if only in whispers. The light softens now, stretching long shadows across the flagstones, each one slow to fade. The last echoes of the day settle into the corners, and the air takes on that cool, weightless feeling just before the night wraps itself around the building. You stand still for a moment, letting your breathing fall into rhythm with the silence. There is no music here anymore, no laughter from behind tapestries, no clink of goblets or rustle of silk, only the faint sigh of wind brushing past old stone. The portraits on the walls seem to lean back into themselves, their colours dimming in the twilight. Outside, the courtyard's arches gather darkness in their curves, and the first faint shimmer of stars begins above the roofline. You imagine the old courts in their quieter hours, candles burning low, conversations trailing off into murmurs, a final step echoing along an empty corridor before the doors are drawn shut for the night. It's a gentler world now. Whatever storms these halls once held have eased into memory. The scandals, the banquets, the whispers, they've all thinned to the same soft thread woven into the fabric of history. You can still trace them if you wish, follow their faint glimmer through time, but they no longer demand. You turn toward the door, moving slowly, your steps matching the unhurried hush. Outside, the air is cooler still, the night just beginning to breathe. A lantern sways faintly in the breeze, its light steady but small against the dark. You take one last look at the walls, the windows, the fading gold of the last sunbeam, and then you step away, leaving the echoes where they belong, in the quiet watch of stone under the soft gaze of the stars.